Jonathan, you're first.
Ready to go? Fantastic. Right, good to see everybody. Well, I'll just start off with trying to explore the polis in both my own personal way through something I'm fascinated by. Um, I read the Politeia when I was out going on walks, trying to do it in like little nice country gardens, and anyway, that just seemed pretty because I just thought I needed to immerse myself in the text in an environment. And so that kind of got me thinking like my love of walking and moving through space. That often like captivates my wonder. And having like city breaks where I go spend days wandering through environments, learning like the language of the layout. And that kind of also like because my dad was a gardener himself, I've always had this fascination how places are laid out and how they're structured and why are they so and what captivates like the imagination of these places. And it captivated me so much so that I did my own degree, undergrad degree in games development, because I actually wanted to explore the idea of environments and locations and how you can, mainly because I remember doing paintings and just really not finding that people could actually engage, interact with the space that I made. So later on, that kind of really opened up my interest in like architecture and gardens. So how does this relate back to the Politeia? And the question of the dikaizune, the appropriateness, the justice. Um, I wanted to inquire on the space of the polis, particularly how throughout the Politeia, particularly from books like 2 to about 8, 9, we're exploring the Kallipolis, the beautiful city, and Socrates goes through all these different aspects, like child rearing to the philosopher kings, etc., etc. And I was just really curious, how does the Dikaizuna lay itself out in in the layout and the terrain of the polis? And really the space in which I recognize that space is important because while we have quite a high the talkings about the forms within through the idea of the eidos of the Kallipolis, I really wanted to explore how that ideal, that eidos of the beautiful city can be seen through the space itself. Because space is that in which things come to be. Therefore, space in that which the polis comes to be. And yet, more importantly, the polis is that in which man or the human person comes to be. So for which man as man, the human person as the human person comes to be within the polis. And then something seems quite important, and there's like a cold, like the space in which the polis resides. There is something that is deeply important, how that brings about the dikaizune. The code joining of peoples, the appropriate relationship between the persons within the space, and the role as man within the order of the cosmos itself. So I wondered about the layout and the cause for remembering. How does it how does it call us in education wise? How does it call us in a way in which we are turned and remembered the things that the forms? And how does it call us forth to us as humans? How do we find ourselves in the space and our environment that calls forth the eternal human soul, ourselves as man? Before we go into this, I kind of actually want to explore the a bit how the Kallipolis is almost describing, particularly in relation to the human person. You have kind of the three metals. You have kind of the bronze, silver, gold, and the three-tier structure. And I was particularly looking at pictures of actually like in real world examples of how the polis of ancient Greeks were structured, because you had the often I write this called the Geotropolis, no, Acropolis, the agora, the marketplace, and the assembly. And I was wondering how that relates to these spaces and these layouts of the environment related to the degradation, which the dialectic explored, sort of the idea of, you had the monarchy or aristocracy, you had the how do those regimes relate and translate into the physical place? And it was just a fun thought exercise for myself. It's like, because you kind of have that higher place, the Acropolis, and there's a movement back and forth. There's a movement up and down. There's the anabasis, catabasis between, the assembly, the marketplace, the place of commerce, and where the temple resides at the top. And that seems like an appropriate relationship in the first regime of the monarchy aristocracy. But then when we go down to the timocracy, which is, if I remember rightly, the one about the military, I was wondering, is there a sense of a beginning of an absence within the highest? Is there a sense in which that all a corruption within the highest space? Does that then become where the gods reside and where the military resides, and the space itself becomes one in which the walls are built around it, where the environment is transformed into that of almost a military base? And then I thought, what about them when it becomes an oligarchy? Do you lose the highest tier? Do you lose the Acropolis? And then does that then place just become abandoned, and then the place of the market becomes the most highest good? And does then that become the space in which the call for money becomes the dominant part, where you have those below? And then again, like with the democracy, I was wondering whether you have a flattening in the environment itself, where you have only the assembly, only the place of discussion, and none of the other tiers are accounted for. I'll soon get into actually how I think the terrain itself will look, but that was just an interesting aspect where I think them tyranny has an interesting turnaround, because it's a flattening where everyone's at the bottom, but then there's a strict Acropolis is reformed, but only for one person, and there is no movement up and down. There's only one person ascending up, and then that one person looks around everyone else. And I don't know how that describes in the physical environment, but as you have the democracy where everything is flattened out, where everything is pushed out and spread out, you almost would see a monolith building, I can imagine, with everything that has just been pushed towards the bottom. But yeah, so then how does this relate in terms of space? As I explored around how the different regimes may look like in terms of the physicality of it, I'm curious how that relates to both remembering and forgetting, and particularly in terms of, like at the end of the allegory of the cave, we have that turning. And I thought, can the appropriate layout of the polis bring about a remembrance, an act of remembering and drawing out from my own personal different experiences of going to different locations? I first want to explore how is it that places make us forget, how places detract us from that inquiring mind, how it takes away from us from exploring, from seeing the appearances, the idos. And I thought about the city in which a location which demands you to forget, demands you not to ask questions. You zone out, you pass through, where only A to B matters. And I think particularly these could be called the corridor cities, the cities where you're only interested from getting from point A to point B, in which you have these straight, high-rising liminal spaces in which the sole purpose is getting from one point to another. You follow the GPS of your next appointment. The polis becomes a unit of measurement in these types of cities where there's one of forgetting. And that unit of measurement of time is one in which of productivity. You know, I was thinking recently about the 15-minute cities, and this attempt to bring common unity into our fragmentations. Live, I respect that's trying to bring people together, but it's the fact that we use that measurement. It's fact called 15 minutes. That the unit of time is the basis from which we want to construct a city that we have to have it. Is a testament to the lack of philosophical groundings that our cities now have. If it is just purely how fast can I get from one place to another. So then yeah, oh, is it time?
Maybe a minute. Okay.
Minute left.
Oops. Yeah.
So I will quickly, I didn't even go through the main things, but the act of remembering so I've got 7 quick points I'm going to go through. A place which brings about kind of the layout is, I think, one in which, through the act of moving around it, we are reminded of our relationship to the environment, especially the sun's movement, the architecture which lays out the honors the sun and the shadow, and where we are in the cosmos. The streets that conceal and reveal, invoking us wonder as a wandering tangents as we walk through them, that don't call us to go from straight point A to point B. In the wandering through, we are reminded of the richness of history, a lineage that's marked out in stone within the landscape itself. And through the layout's relationship with the natural terrain, that we are reminded of our common unity between the land and what is demarcated in that which we reside. And I thought of those that common place of leisure, in which we are called to find our demos, our common realm, and that appropriate way of living that we are called together. And of course, a layout that is circumnavigating the highest point, as you said, of that 3-tier structure with the calypso at the top, with the temple, the church, the polis, all reminds us of our common binding, our common ground in which we are called together, and we are called as we reside in this place. So I always imagine, I guess you could call the beautiful city as a 3-tiered circular maze, in which we are in relationship with ourselves, with others. We remind ourselves as we are as man in the cosmos. That is my talk.
That's you're starting up here. Very good. Excellent. So if there are any questions, let us know now, please. Comments. James, yeah, go ahead.
I was just commenting on the vision of the 3-tiered circular city, very evocative.
Yeah, it's like, for me, it's a complete contrast to the flattening streets in which you're literally just in corridor cities. One that pulls you upwards and downwards is like a catabasis, anabasis, a movement up and down. And it's one that you're not just point A to point B. It's like you're exploring it. You're allowed to explore the terrain. Yes, thank you for the question. Atlantis, good shout.
Do you know Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities?
No, tell me more.
Oh, well, it's a novel in the form of a bunch of stories about imaginary cities, supposedly Marco Polo describing all of these cities to the Great Khan. But these very philosophically schematic ideas of what a city could be reminded me a bit of that.
Well, I've done my own little city designs. I probably should have brought them up here, but yeah, I did little sketches before. I always love to sketch in ideas of beautiful cities and how one could, especially ones up and down mountains. Like, that's probably my favorite fictions are one that explore magic, like one how one city can be constructed. So, yeah.
I just think that what you did really well, and so I also want to read this essay. Is it written?
Yeah, well, most of it is. I probably little bits I've added onto it, but yeah, mostly written.
Good. So you know, I'll ask you, everyone who's written something, to submit it anyways, and then I'll send it back to you with comments. But what really came through is that Die Kausende is so poorly translated as just justice, with all the contemporary connotations that we have, because what we then forget is that it is a feminine principle that orders the layout of the entire Callipolis, in which the male and the female, etc., all of this comes together, joins together in harmonia. And to bring in the Acropolis example of Athens, and what stands as the highest is the temple to the gods, and not mammon, money, or in the case of London, the shard, cutting the sky.
Mm.
You know, it used to be a law that in London, no building was allowed to be higher than St. Paul's.
So, well,
And well, here we are. Now we have a building called the Shard. You know, I wonder who finances this and says, "Yes, I have no shame. I'm happy to buy an apartment for £50 million in a building called garbage, something other people would throw away." So, but that's where we are. That's the 21st century. Excellent. So, any more questions or remarks on Jonathan's essay? Andrew, yeah.
I just heard the other week that, not a very cheerful note, but one of the guys that flew one of the planes into the World Trade Center he had a PhD in architecture from the University of Hamburg, and he was offended by the sort of high-rise nature of the buildings in the West, and considered the West had sort of destroyed the Islamic architecture in, I don't know where it was from, Lebanon or Syria or somewhere. So, well, architecture obviously does reflect philosophy in a way, doesn't it? Some people see it that way, but I suppose if you studied it to PhD level, then you will do automatically.
Yeah. For Schopenhauer, it's the second highest art form. For Nietzsche, it's the highest art form. Music stands high for Schopenhauer. But yeah, how we understand what is, it feeds into everything, including how we build buildings. And the 15-minute city is a great example, because it is it's supposed to make a community and make everything walkable, but it is ultimately just going to be a shopping mall. A shopping
yes.
mall with high rises on top of it. And this is nothing new. This is all over. Italy and Germany and France has plenty of these terrible constructs. Anyways, I could go on and on and on and lament about the state of things. That's sign of my old age. Jonathan, yeah, you
Unit
have
of
the last word.
measurement.
Sorry?
I was just saying, just unit of measurement, the fact that a city can only be just marked by how long it takes from point A to point B, just like, oh my goodness, is that what the philosophy is now of a city?
I mean, ideally, it's a 0-minute city, because there's 0 people living there, and it's just bots that send bitcoins to each other. So, Paul Rodriguez, you're next. There's only one Paul. Why did I say? But Paul, you're next.
So I'll be reading an essay. It's a bit rough, and I had to cut a lot to get it into possibly 8 minutes.
Okay.
Start now and talk fast.
Yes, please do.
What kind of thinking are we doing when we decide what axioms to think with? Are formal systems just tools of a higher kind of thinking? Is there a regress of meta-axioms? Or is there another kind of thinking formal systems cannot express? Equivalently ask, why do we accept any truth? To prove anything, we can only appeal to the axioms of a formal system, But a formal system can only be grounded in one of dogmatism, infinite regress, or circular argument, the familiar trilemma. Formal systems cannot step behind themselves, they cannot be self-grounding. There must be something else, or we must remain silent. Plato's something else is dialectic. In the analogy of the line, Plato divides the intelligible and the visual and subdivides the intelligible into thought and understanding. Thought, not understanding, reasons from axioms. But understanding is not therefore beyond reason. It is not direct revelation of absolute truth. Dialectic is only available to the philosopher, and only to the philosopher who has mastered formal thinking, but dialectic is not a kind of formal system. Dialectic is not non-axiomatic, but pre-axiomatic. Dialectics are not a prelude that ends where axioms begin, but the root of a chord, grounding and echoing axioms at another level. Unlike formal systems and common opinions, dialectic cannot be still, cannot be silent. Dialectic moves because it must move. It must rise by steps and points, and it must ascend. Dialectic offers an escape from the trilemma of formal proof because it is not an alternative to logic, but the missing harmony that brings logic to life. Dialectics must posit, dialectics must educate, because there is no such thing as dialectic at rest. We never finish dialectic. Dialectic ever having happened means it is happening now. In Plato's world, philosophy is alone in moving outside formal systems, but we are not in Plato's world. Beside dialectics, we have another project that transcends formal systems, which is science. Of course, the day-to-day of science takes place within formal systems, but science purports to offer a higher criterion for their validity and relevance. Systems are devoted to hypotheses, and hypotheses must submit to the trial of experiment. But where do hypotheses come from? From within science, the origin of the hypothesis, the act of thinking outside formal systems, is ineffable, or creative, which is how scientists say ineffable. Science cannot provide the vocabulary to understand or justify science, because science's self-justification is self-contradictory. It is not always measurably better in the general case to know the truth. Truth is painful. Truth destroys our pleasing illusions. Truth drives away meaning. Truth is the brutal, devastating sun outside the warm, womb-like cave. Truth is a wasteland where we cannot dwell. Historically, science and philosophy begin alike in despair at thinking defeating itself and cutting off our access to what is real, whether in sophism or scholasticism. Philosophy and science both start by imagining what thought could do if allowed to align itself with human good, but they are led by very different ideas of the good. The standard of scientific truth is what extends human control over nature. Plato's standard of philosophical truth is what makes for better living for the whole at every level, soul, city, cosmos. Because the question of justice is not only the question, what is justice, but also, is it worthwhile to be just? And proving justice worthwhile requires first proving that anything can be worthwhile, not just useful, but worthwhile in itself, self-sufficient. To answer the question of the value of justice, the Republic has to answer not only what is justice, but also what is value. The Republic makes an explicit analogy between city and soul, but also an implicit analogy between city and soul on one side and cosmos on the other. For the citizens of the city, for the parts of the soul, what is appropriate and just is its role. And in the cosmos, what is appropriate or just for a thing, what makes it thinkable, knowable, even true, is also its fitness for its role, its idea. What is unfit for its role, what is fit for a role not its own, is false. When we call things by unjust or inappropriate names, we invite confusion and decay. This fitness after its own kind, not fitness for human use, this fitness after its idea is the good, and this good is to the cosmos as justice is to the city and the soul. Plato finds the value of justice not in a moral or theological order, but in an ontological order, the value of each and every thing, like every citizen in the city, like every part in the soul. Its value is in being what it is. In our roles, in their forms, are the condition of value, the ought in every is. Things have their forms, the form of the bed, the form of the table, the roles they have to play in the cosmos, and, as in souls and in the city, a thing that is true can only be one thing, can only be itself. Everything in Plato has its role, has its purpose in being what it is to perfection and fulfilling its idea. But in science, only one role remains. Plato's good becomes Aristotle's telos, but we have lost teleology so completely we misunderstand it, project backward by equating the purpose of a thing to its use. The bed is defined operationally as the thing for sleeping, but that is not teleology. Teleology is not the same as a thing having a purpose. It is the understanding that to have a purpose, the thing must first be a purpose. A bed is not a thing whose purpose is to be slept in. A bed is a thing whose purpose is to be suitable for the purpose of sleep. The story of the cave, of course, is myth, not history. Plato is pointing thought in a certain direction. But in the Platonic spirit of mythopoiesis, we may ask, what if the philosopher finds no more golden souls to bring into the light? Remember, the one who leaves the cave does not escape from it, but is pulled from it. What happens to the next generation? How do souls of other metals react to seeing the sun? The golden soul, of course, becomes a philosopher. The silver soul becomes a conqueror. Aristotle, after all, took Alexander from the cave. But the bronze soul becomes a scientist. The new philosopher, on returning to the cave, seeks to take control of the shadows, to make the show of appearances match their reality. The philosopher benefits the cave dwellers by bringing their indirect experience of things nearer the ideas of those things. But when the new scientist returns, it is the cave itself that changes. Things are different now for the cave dwellers. Their seats are cushioned, their shackles are padded, the cave is warmed for them. The shadows are cast against screens instead of bare rock, and the flicker of firelight is replaced by the glow of filaments and diodes. But while the shadow play is upgraded, its contents remain the same. And the scientist's improvements to the cave are far from futile. Think about spending your whole life chained in a cave. It'll be a life of wounds and sores, not to mention debilitating vitamin deficiencies. After the scientist is done, the cave dwellers live no more in truth, but they live less in pain. The philosopher corrects the shadows, the scientist upgrades the cave. Note the philosopher and the scientist are acting independently. The shadows can be rectified or the cave improved without the other being affected. But while science and philosophy are independent pursuits, they are not independent projects. There is an essential dependency. The dissemination of philosophy changes everyone. Gold from the golden gilds all souls. But the dissemination of science has no effect on character. The scientist must submit to a discipline of discovery, but the beneficiaries of science learn nothing from the fruits of that mastery. Technology makes no demand on the one who uses it. Whatever it took to build the machine, no one learns from pushing a button. In this way, science is self-defeating. The more comfortable the cave becomes, the less anyone is inclined to leave it. Science can satisfy desire, but it cannot steer desire. Science depends on philosophy to justify it. Whenever a scientist expresses despair over a lack of public trust in science and faith in scientific progress, they are implicitly pleading for philosophy to intervene on science's behalf. The salvation of science from its own success, if science can be saved, is in the hands of the philosopher king. I think I ran a little bit over.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Questions, comments?
Paul, I would just like to say that I really enjoy your writing. I can tell you've done it. You know what I mean? Like, I know you're a writer,
Thank you.
but really, really enjoy your use of language. And also what you were saying too. I mean, not to, I don't want to, I'm not dismissing that, but yeah, it's really, really nice. Thank you.
Yeah, but Paul always writes the essay I would like to write, but can't.
Paul, what I'm hearing people saying is you should start teaching a writing course.
What a takedown. The bronze souls becomes a scientist. Oof. I just saw Joanna's just laughing away in the corners, like, and just like you just kept on going with that scientist part in the cave. That was, yeah, particularly like saying how almost trying to make it more comfortable in the cave. The scientists were, rather than striving for truth, it was just like, okay, let's just at least make this, at least have a nice time in here. But
Yeah, but what? Go on, yeah. Sorry.
oh no, I'm curious what you're going to say.
No, I've spoken so much. I thought you were done. So go on.
Yeah, I was just trying to find the question in which it was. I liked how you brought it back to the sense of the philosopher king at the end, but also how the scientists themselves were trying to advance like the shadows, trying to make people more comfortable in their little like, even though there was no more sense of the truth, we just neglect that over there, and we'll strive, but we don't have any orientation on what we're striving for, what we're gratifying. That's one thing I appreciate about how you describe the scientists. That trying to find the question there, but there must probably just did that just pop up for you? The whole dynamic of the scientists in the cave.
In the longer original draft of this, there was a bit more in the way of comparing Plato to the Bacon and the Republic to Plato's New Atlantis.
I see. Yes, because you'd tell me about Atlantis. I think I saw one of your messages to me. Hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to say also to both of you that it was great, both talks. What I wanted to mention to Paul is what he said about dialectic being pre-axiomatic. I found that to be an excellent point, so kudos for that.
Thank you.
He has books out, Paul. You're shilling your books again. I am, not you. So, Paul M. Rodriguez.
One of them's the Endless City, isn't it?
Yes. One of them on the Endless City. I mean, what do scientists spend their time on, for example? Producing potato chips or crisps that imitate the flavor of barbecue. And that are basically food that's programmed or constructed in such a way that you want to eat the entire bag. That's what we spend our mental resources on, apparently. That's one of the things. To imitate something that never even existed or should have existed. Speaking of bronze and souls, I very strong also think that what you said about dialectics. I look forward to reading this. The email, I'll send her the email on Tuesday. And then, as always, we'll try and figure out how we publish this. And I have more of an eye on these things this year than maybe last year. Yeah, Paul, go on.
Without the 8-minute constraint, I may send you a slightly longer version.
Yeah. No, so whatever you submit can be much longer, and then we can think about how to publish, whether we do longer, video, audio essays of them and publish them as PDFs alongside. So that's up to you then, how much. If you want to record it again, we can do that as well. And also with a link to your website, Paul, but you just have to include it on the form, as you know. Anyways. Okay, any more questions or remarks for Paul? Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, one sec. This is way around. Paul, Andrew is next. Andrew?
Sorry, I just got distracted there. Someone asked me if I wanted a pizza, so right, so it's my turn. Okay, yeah, I prepared something on Derrida and also a bit on Levinas, but I think I'll probably just have time for Derrida, so I'll read that. I had to shorten it. I hope it's not too long. So, in his 1967 book of Grammatology, Jacques Derrida said, "Il n'y a pas hors du texte," a statement which appeared to be telling us there is nothing outside the text, but which he later corrected to mean there's nothing outside the context. Either way, it was an attack on the idea of Platonic forms. In his book of 1 year later, Writing Indifference, he explained that the entire history of philosophy is thought starting from its Greek origin. It's not a matter of Westernism or historicism. We need to break with the Greek. Following on from Jean-Paul Sartre, who had said there was no such thing as essence, Derrida now declared there was no such thing as eidos, arche, logos, telos, energia, ousia, aletheia, not to mention transcendentality, metaphysics, consciousness, ontology, God, meaning, and even the human. Get rid of it all, he said. At a 1966 conference on structuralism held in the US in French, influenced by his friend Paul de Man, who had already started to demonstrate how texts were in fact just rhetorical, i.e. subjective, Derrida delivered a speech that was critical of the method of structuralism devised by Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had sought to find binaries in myths and in literature using a system of signs and signifiers, the signifiers being similar to Platonic forms. So the sign was in the text and the signifier was the idea, the form. Derrida said these couldn't be fixed. All that existed was interrelations to other words within the text, which constituted the context. Meaning could not be restricted to certain words. The history of philosophy, Derrida explained, was a history of rhetorical centres, with the most important philosophers having managed to create a new centre that had superseded the old one. So Hegel had introduced self-consciousness as an centre, Freud the subconscious, Nietzsche the death of God, Heidegger Dasein, but all these were just other words for the logos. Since logos was merely a rhetorical device, all of the centres descended from it were also rhetorical devices. For this reason, it was necessary to use a trace or a mark, a sort of placeholder, when discussing philosophy which was descended from the Greek. All were based on meaning, which led to ontology, and ontology led to violence. This had already been proposed before him by Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, who had said his philosophy was a return to Plato. So Derrida, in many ways, I think, highlighted the singularity which had been Sartre's nothingness. It was a continuation of that, Nichtsein, non-being or negative theology. But he would have rejected that label because that was based on being, and he rejected all labels. The only singularity he accepted was deconstruction. And when he was asked what this was, he said he didn't know. So Derrida envisaged the centres he wished to deconstruct as being at the centre of a circle. And it was the job of a philosopher, he maintained, to stand on the edge of the circle and shout down anybody who was trying to create a new centre. This was the only way to break with the tradition of philosophy as it had been carried out to date, and to break from the Greek, get away from what he called phono-logocentrism, the idea that the logos derives from the speech act, something which he said could be traced back to the God of the Hebrew Bible, who created the world by speaking, and it was a notion continued by Socrates in his dialogues. He also claimed writing was more important than speaking. He said writing was a pharmacon, a sort of cathartic process, which was beneficial to the individual, but there were multiple meanings possible for the reader, and there was no connection to the forms outside the text. The reader was touched by a text. It was a sort of intuitive response, but it wasn't rational enough to provide a meaning, or at least a single meaning. It reminds us in a way of the urge which the fighters had maybe to find out where the flux of the river came from, which is something Heidegger talked about. So this dislike of rational understanding inevitably means, in my opinion, that Derrida would take the position of Thrasymachus in the Politeia. He would prefer the perfect injustice to dikaiozuna. He would try to deconstruct dikaiozuna and end up at the position of Thrasymachus. The influence of Derrida's post-structuralist thinking on contemporary society is considerable, as is the scientific approach to language, I think, which Claude Lévi-Strauss was using, which is the basis of AI and ChatGPT and Google. All these neural networks come from language maps. So both these influences, Derrida and the scientific approach to language, are very present in our present society. Education and many other areas of life are also dominated by statistics, the humanities, and learning as a scholar has been marginalized. Everything is down to neuroscience, neurolinguistics. And on the other hand, we're also experiencing a fragmentation of education, which I think you can also partly put down to Derrida, a proliferation of new subjects. I think creative writing courses, for instance, also I would say are similar to Derrida's Pharmakon. The idea that literature can be produced without reference to existing canon, just by a unconscious writing process also, without dialectics, you might say. Of course, the obvious one is cancel culture. I think we can give Derrida a part of the responsibility for that too. Only this week, the Diocese of Birmingham in the Church of England posted a job ad for an officer for deconstructing whiteness, for instance, which I think is a clear reference to Derrida, rather than an anti-racism officer. It was an officer for deconstructing whiteness. So I think in many ways, Derrida has himself become a center. He's become what he disliked about other philosophers. He's no longer on the edge of the circle. He's in the middle. So we can then consider who might be on the edge. And I think we might say these days Plato is on the edge of one of his circles. But rather than deconstructing Derrida, maybe we should just reconstruct Plato. And maybe by using logos, ousia, eidos, and all these things he didn't like, talking about them, maybe using his traces if we're going to use his philosophy. By a process of mimesis, we might remember this philosophy again and reconstruct something sensible. Yeah, so the main thing is to read Plato, discuss him, and write about him. Because if the forms exist, we have the forms do exist. We've got different words for an apple. We can say apple, pom, manzana, mela, but we all have the same form in our minds, and they're necessary too. So we can all appreciate surrealism as an art. People might eat off chairs, sleep on tables, but it's difficult to imagine such an approach having any kind of longevity. I think, in my opinion, Derrida said he wanted to actually be a writer of literature, but he wrote philosophy instead. And I get the impression he wants to break out of the prosaic, out of a philosophical text, into the surreal or the poetic. And if he was to do this, I think he would also be the sort of poet that Plato would like to ban from the polis, because he would no doubt write poetry which is merely for entertainment, but not really containing any truth or logic. So, yeah, that was my impression of Derrida from reading one or two of his writings. And what's the time-wise?
Yeah, if you've got a couple of minutes, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, go
All
ahead.
right, I've got a bit about Levinas too. I can go back here. Yeah, so Levinas also, Derrida attended a lot of his lectures. Derrida also, Levinas already talked about ontology being violence, but Levinas called his own philosophy a return to Plato. For the Levinas, first philosophy was not ontology, but it was ethics. Faced with the eternal human experience of alienation, he said, each individual could overcome alienation by responsibility towards the other. This was not due to the presence of a god, but due to what he called l'autrui, or in English, otherness, which is a sort of Platonic form or ideal. And actions which were focused on this ideal, on this form, towards the other, towards the face of the other, he said, provided a sort of metaphysics, transcendence, but he said that the transcendence wasn't such that one person oversteps their boundaries as an individual. He stuck to the idea of cogito ergo sum, and he was continuing the ideas of Husserl, of phenomenology. He rejected Heidegger. He studied with Heidegger when he was young, Levinas, but after he was also a Jewish, of Jewish origin originally, and obviously was appalled at the way Heidegger supported the Nazis. So he then rejected ontology as a result. So then Derrida, according to Derrida, however, Levinas was just really playing language games. Ontology was still at the heart of his philosophy, despite he claimed to have rejected it. It was still a sort of Levinas had said there was no God involved in his philosophy. It was just this Platonic ideal in another world, like it was like a two-world paradigm. But Derrida said this was still just religion by another name, and it was also metaphysics. Metaphysics could not be separated from ontology. Metaphysics was also justification for violence, and Levinas was also promoting a sort of truth or transcendence. And so he was still philosophizing based on the Logos. He also said he was using Hegel's system, despite being critical of Hegel. He said Levinas objected to finite totality, as he called totalitarianism totality, and said that ontology was a totality. But he said, Derrida said it was just another time of totality, his philosophical system. So in my view, it was a sort of two-world system, so it was absolutizing Plato. So it was Platonism rather than Plato. Okay.
Thank you. Excellent. Derrida as the new center. That was very good. I think it was your best essay so far, so I look forward to reading it. Questions, remarks?
I thought it was an interesting connection between Derrida and Thrasymachus, showing that they both kind of deconstruct the ideal that's in view, and then you're left with only kind of Thrasymachus' position that the only thing to do is advocate for power underneath all these ideals. So yeah, it was an interesting connection to the Republic.
Yeah, I didn't find anywhere he actually commented directly on the Republic and said whether he was supporting Thrasymachus, but it is the impression I got from reading his stuff was that inevitably he would take his position.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah,
I like, as you say, to big on that, or it's like the perfect injustice. The fact that he did that, and the fact that, like for Symmachus, he said that. But I also love the fact that how you pointed to a point where he's trying to break the center, decenter where Plato and the Greeks were coming from, and in fact he became the center himself. And so then the only way is reconstructing the center in which he pulled it away from. I found that almost like quite ironic that he was trying his best to like break down, but it was just the dramatic irony in his own methods.
Yeah, I think it's just so radical that it can never become a reality, which is why I think it's a sort of almost surrealism, what he's proposing. You can't just sort of sweep the whole of history under the carpet, and you're going to get swallowed up by your own system, the way he describes it. If you compare Heidegger, he also went back maybe to prior to Socrates, but he didn't sort of want to just get rid of it all. He still allowed it to exist and to be commented on, but he was saying that the source of philosophy was maybe Heraclitus looking at the river. But that doesn't mean we get rid of Plato completely.
Past. So respect.
Hmm.
What was the impact? Sorry, has anyone else got any questions? What's the impact on you for finding this out?
Me?
Yeah.
I just thought it was just, to be honest, well, reading Plato was a lot more uplifting than reading Derrida. Levinus I sort of quite liked at first, but I sort of also got the impression he was sort of, well, not really as positive as Plato. He was sort of getting rid of dialectics completely, and it seems to me if you don't perform dialectics yourself, and somebody else would do it for you. You can't get rid of dialectics because I think you have a responsibility to do it. So yeah. So I was glad that I'd read Plato before I read Derrida, the other guy.
Yeah, this is very important what you just said, Andrew, by the way. If it happens the other way around, one really you will have, I think one will have a hard time getting an access to this other way of thinking because it's always already tainted and wants to just insinuate something else that's going, that's not being said, something that's being implied. But what happens there in terms of so the folly, but to some degree also it's why it's so powerful of post-structuralism or postmodernism is that it's nominalism. So it simply posits one word after another, makes up words as it goes, then something happens, and that's what's strange about them all, is that they begin to believe in their own words and concepts. So the names and the words they've posited, power, etc., all of a sudden become conceptually real, but in a platonistic sense. And then they run after them. And this is ultimately what sophistry does. This is what Plato and Aristotle realize, is that this destroys access to the phenomena. So saying phenomena, saving the phenomena becomes necessary, but also difficult. Yeah. And this can come in any, doesn't have to stay politically one-sided. This you could have postmodern reactionaries as well. So who just posit something and then make it conceptually real, essentialize, etc., where there is no essence, purely by positing, and not by the painstaking way of going through dialectics or diirisis. Yeah, sorry, Andrew, if you want to respond, to anyone else who wants to comment on something. Dawson, yeah.
Yes, I think this is the immediate problem of Derrida's influences, that his disciples now want to use the concept of deconstruction without having qualified it, verifying it, and they implement it. And what happens is it's become larger than life. The concept become a reality itself. And then then Derrida must come in and say, no, I actually meant the following. I meant deconstruction must lead to reconstruction in order to sort of put a limit on what the disciples are doing with my concept, because now I have to requalify it, redefine it, because it's become overemployed, overused.
Yeah.
but his intention was such, he was very much into dissuasion and bringing us into suspicion, and that's probably his best quality, is he put the text under suspicion. And if we're following him in his best, we would be doing the same thing without just imitating and parroting his concepts.
Yeah, but that's the kind of sophistry that's misguided, because you're just insinuating that someone is, because of their privilege, saying something. It's not. It's the funny thing is that it never stays on the text, and so this is not how you can save Derrida. I'm sorry. That's exactly what's wrong with it. And he does not want a reconstruction. It's pure dissuasion. It's just suspicion, and you can't go here. This is all wrong, and it always has to hijack the logos. To why would you believe anything they say if it's not true? Why? Is it true or not, what they're saying? If it's not true, if there's no truth, I don't have to listen to you. There's nothing they can actually say. So this boils down to simply asserting power.
Which is fascism, really, which is what they're protesting about in the first place.
Well, it's something else. It's a kind of closed off totalitarianism.
Yeah.
That is closed off in the sense of generating its own. We talked about this last year. I forgot the quote now. I have it somewhere in here, where he basically just refutes everything that he does himself. I don't know if you remember, this was during the Baudrillard seminar. Yeah, well, Dawson.
With Leotard, he's more pronounced. I prefer Leotard because he writes out a short book called The Postmodern Condition, and it basically says incredulity towards meta narratives, and he's cognizant of this. He's like, I am a student of Gorgias and Protagoras, because what they were able to do is what I want to do today, and I want to overturn everything. And he's very transparent about it, at least in that sense.
Yes. Yeah. So they're not avant-garde at all. It's the oldest thing in the book. But it generates these ghost-like entities that then literally, I mean, he's the guy who came up with hauntology. But what's haunting us are all these empty shells of made-up words that become essentialized as Platonistic forms. That's Derrida's great achievement, is that you have entire generations of academic students who can't think, who go through 4 years of studying philosophy at the wrong department and come out of it completely insane. There's no other word. Madness. Just mad. They can't think. They're triggered. They're literally triggered. This is the language that they use. Yeah? They're triggered by what they hear. Ooh, this word is logos, is phallocentric. What does that mean? Anyways, okay. That's the old man rambling. So, Wendy is next, because some aren't here. Frau Dorfmeier.
Hello.
Hello.
I went off in a little bit of a different direction than what I initially stated, but I don't think anybody will mind. And yeah, I had to cut mine short too, but I think it'll make sense.
The final one can be longer, and then we'll have so you can, final version can be much longer, and then maybe we publish recordings of them. So if you send it to me, you can have the long version, not the abridged one. Just wanted to say this again. Okay. No. Off you go. Sorry.
Okay. It's an essay. Okay. Prologue. Plato's words transport me through time. Words would pass me, moving towards where I was, as I passed by them, moving towards where they had been. Necessity is a condition and not a cause in Plato's metaphysics. To begin, I want to differentiate between necessity as a condition and the necessary as a cause. Necessity found in Plato is not because this or that is necessary, but it is from a necessity that this or that occurs. In this sense, necessity is primordial to our essence, to our souls, and respectively to the soul of the polis and the cosmos. Briefly, I will present what I heard in the writings of Plato, focusing on the myth of and a few sections of the Timaeus. In the myth of the source of the myth, a fallen soldier, awakens and tells us of a wonderful place where there were two openings side by side in the ground and two others up above in the heavens corresponding to these. Those coming down from heaven and up from beneath the ground arrived. Those who were directed towards the meadow had passed by the judges without a word, and each of them was only too glad to pass through in silence. The judgment resets the souls in preparation for the return to life. The judgment occurs out of the necessity of this return. On the 8th day, they had to get up and go on a journey, arriving after 4 days at a place from which they could see a shaft of light like a pillar extending from above through the whole heaven and earth. The light was more than like a rainbow. The light was more like a rainbow than anything else, only brighter and more pure. The returning souls continue, and a day's journey brought them to where the light was. This light binds the heavens, and from the extremities they saw extended the spindle of necessity, by which all the separate rotations are set in motion. Ananke, the goddess of necessity, is holding the spindle. Ananke is a primordial goddess. She emerged self-formed at the dawn of creation and is not the cause of a union between the gods, but reigns as an integral part of the first principles in the Greek mythos and in Plato's metaphysics. The spindle itself turns in the lap of necessity. On the rim of each its circles is perched a siren who is carried round with it, uttering a single sound, a single musical note. All 8 together combine to produce one single harmony. There are 3 others seated in a circle at equal distances, each on a throne. These are the Fates, the daughters of necessity, and they sing to the accompaniment of the sirens. A prophet above takes lots and distributes these lots to the souls to choose their next life. He tells them, "You will choose a guardian spirit for yourselves, and you will then be joined to it by necessity." When all the souls had chosen their lives, they approached each of the 3 fates, and the guardian spirit was given. Their fate was confirmed and sealed as such. And from there, without turning back, the souls went beneath the throne of necessity. Necessity here is a primordial condition that reigns above the causal actions of the 3 fates. And then they went to sleep, and around the middle of the night there was a thunderstorm and an earthquake, and they suddenly carried away from there upwards to their births, all in different directions like shooting stars. In the foreword to the Timaeus, translated by Thomas Taylor, R. Catesby Taliaferro writes, "The reader must, however, carefully observe that when we say it is necessary that the cause of the universe should operate according to power, that this necessity, which Aristotle defines as the perfectly simple, cannot have a multifarious subsistence. And hence this term, when applied to the most exalted natures, to whom alone in the sense it belongs, signifies nothing more than an impossibility of subsisting otherwise than they do, without falling from the perfection of their nature. This idea is not a choice, but a decision arising from necessity. And as we dive deeper into the Timaeus, we hear Plato. But it is likewise requisite to give a place in our discourse to the productions of necessity. For the generation of the world being mingled, it was produced from the composition of intellect and necessity. But intellect ruling over necessity persuaded it to lead the most part of generated natures to that which is best. And hence necessity being vanquished by wise persuasion from these 2 principles, from these 2 as principles, the world arose. This idea is brought in by Taliaferro when saying there is the final attempt to reach an understanding of necessity itself without the mediation of anything else. Timaeus says it is like a receptacle, but without any shape, like the mathematician's space, but without the coordinates actualized, having a pure movement with nothing moving. Although the Timaeus is Pythagorean in substance, mathematics springs from necessity. Here we see mirrored within mathematics itself an exemplar of the world. The law determining the cut is as oneness, the two classes, the two-ness of being, the many rational numbers, the mathematicals mediating their own infinity, appearing as a relentless necessity, and the whole determined as the mixed. The logos of necessity implicit in the myth of is disclosed in the Timaeus. But as the human nature is twofold, he showed them that the more excellent kind was that which would afterwards be called man. And as souls are from necessity engrafted in bodies, and as something exceeds to and something departs from such bodies, he declared to them that in the first place, one conic sense produced by violent passions was necessary to all. Thomas Taylor explains, but this conic sense produced by violent passions, of which Plato now speaks, does not subsist from itself, but from the natures by which it is used, and knows what it knows with passion. Neither do the motions in the soul pervade everywhere and as far as to the body, but there is a motion of the soul belonging to itself by itself, such as is that which is intellectual. The music of the spheres is a common translation used to describe the harmony of the sirens and the fates, and in the Timaeus this appears as the co-joining of the logos and the mythos. Harmony possessing motions, allied to the revolutions of our soul, is useful to the man who employs the muses in conjunction with intellect. Indeed, it was given us by the muses for the purpose of reducing the dissonant circulation of the soul to an order and symphony accommodated to its nature. As the myth of error ends, sending the souls to their birth like shooting stars, the Timaeus mirrors this. And having thus composed the universe, he distributed souls equal in number to the stars, inserting each in each, and causing them to ascend as into a vehicle. He pointed out to them the nature of the universe and announced to them the laws of fate, showing them that the first generation, orderly distributed to all, was one, lest any particular soul should be allotted a less portion of generation than another. Thank you.
Brilliant. Superb. Yeah, really beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot more going on there than I could. There's a lot going on. I kept thinking more and more. Yeah.
Well, but you see, here it has to, at some point, there is an end, and that's the idea. So, or else there's no form. It becomes an amorphous totalitarianism. No, this was excellent. And as I said before, the final essays don't have a word limit. So, any questions or remarks, comments, etc.? Yeah, maybe James, why don't you begin and say why this clarified the myth of for you?
Again, nothing too deep, but I really like the way that you set that out, Wendy. It was much clearer hearing it read out to me anyway than reading it in the book. And just thinking about that now, we might imagine students sat round listening to this and it making much more clarity rather than on the page, as your storytelling just did then.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Okay, more alla tu logo, not to me, but to the logos having listened. It's not alive, and we don't read and discuss it.
I would like to say, though, that it was the Timaeus that really added to Plato for me. I understand there's a lot of dialogues, and I'm not dismissing any of the others because I think they all are part of it. But for some reason, I don't know why yeah. I think because I got caught by that idea of the necessity as a condition, that it sort of, kind of grew. And then when I read the Timaeus, and there's a lot more in the Timaeus that I could have said that I think relates to the Republic in particular, which I will. I'll continue with the paper. But yeah, I thought, yeah. So that's the only way I would have been able to, I think, develop that the way I did. If I had not read the Timaeus, I don't think I would have said what I said. I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, Dawson.
Yes, Wendy, I think perhaps the Timaeus, because of its style, it has the long speeches and employs so much imagery, and that perhaps was able to kind of concretize it for you. Do you think that because of the format of the dialogue, more of the speech format helped paint a picture?
Well, I think it's also what he was talking about. I mean, there's a lot more there I could go into than I have. I kind of just scratched the surface and focused in on necessity. But yes, I agree with you. The longer version is, well, it turns it more into a story, like a part, like the myths in the Republic. So there's that kind of similarity, but and I know the Timaeus is seen as, yeah, I don't know. I actually, it's, well, like, science or Pythagoras, but I don't know. I'm hearing some other stuff in there. So I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you. That's great. I agree.
Yeah, so
I just had to think of in theological studies, there's this concept of you have to let the Bible interpret the Bible. And I think this, Wendy, was a beautiful example of also letting Plato interpret Plato and letting him bring out more and a deeper understanding of himself through his own text. And so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank Wendy and what she did with the Timaeus. It's something that resonates a lot also with me. It was very helpful to understand even the Republic or even some of the other dialogues like the laws, for example, that they are more different in style. So thank you very much, Wendy.
it was a true comment in the sense of commentare, to think with, not a contemporary comment, which is what I have to say. Maybe that's a book in the making, Wendy. Yeah. Don't underestimate. Once you start writing, it turns into a book quickly. So I would keep at it and keep writing. Do you want to respond to any of the remarks?
Oh, I just want to say thank you to everybody. This has been a great experience, and especially you, Johannes, as well as being our guider. What do we call you? Our leader?
Careful,
Anyhow.
or else it will be taken out of context or something.
Oh yeah, no, I don't mean that. I just meant as a,
a weirdo
as
running
as allowing us to gather. Basically,
a gatherer.
Thank you for allowing us to gather.
Pied Piper, leading the rats from the cities.
There you go.
The poisoned wells of philosophia or something. No, I'm just a madman running around sleeping in barrels. And none of what I say is it's all ironic, of course. There was Socrates' attempt at not having to drink the hemlock. So you should continue to write on this, and then turn it into an very extended text. Yeah, that was excellent. Haris is next. Haris.
Yes. Allow me to share the screen. Okay, so it's very good that I got the opportunity to present right after Wendy, because also the topic of my presentation has to do with the Timaeus dialogue. And what I will try to do is I will try to present an elaboration on Plato's view on mathematics. In Plato's philosophy, mathematics played a central role. Plato held a profound appreciation for mathematics and its role in understanding the nature of reality. He believed that mathematics revealed the true nature of the world and provided a path to knowledge and understanding. Plato's view on mathematics had a lasting influence on Western philosophy and science, as Plato saw mathematics as a means of accessing knowledge about the forms and therefore about the ultimate nature of reality. He believed that through rigorous mathematical reasoning and contemplation, one could gain insights into the eternal truths and principles that underlie the physical world that we are all embedded in. Mathematics, according to Plato, provided a bridge between the sensible world of appearances and also the intelligible world, the world of the forms. So in my elaboration, I will try to address not a passage from the Republic, but rather a complementary passage, as Wendy mentioned before during her talk, from another of Plato's famous dialogues, namely the Timaeus. I am focusing specifically on the creation of the word soul from Timaeus lines 34c up to 36c, where Timaeus explains how the soul of the world got created. This passage is notoriously difficult as it contains a detailed account of how the demiurge fashions the substance of the soul from a mixture of pairs. And I would like to highlight this word pairs because it will be of relevance in my presentation that I would like to, in my demonstration, let's say, that I would like to present to all of you. These pairs have to do with the indivisible and the divisible, and also with the same and the other. And one might wonder, how can these seemingly unmixable things, like what is indivisible and what is divisible, be mixed together? I take that this is a historical puzzle of epic proportions that Timaeus leaves us as the audience, let's say, to work and figure it out. So what I wanted to suggest here is that we can understand this passage in these few lines in terms of 4 parts. The first one is the prologue. I don't need to go through it, but it gives us, let's say, an insight into this difference of the pairs of the nature, let's say, of the same and of the other, and of the indivisible and the divisible. Secondly, we have the introduction, that is rather important, where in the dialogue, the following is mentioned. He took the 3 elements of the same, the other, and the essence, and mingled them into one form. So we have the forms once again here. Compressing by force the reluctant and the unsociable nature of the other into the same. When he had mingled them with the essence, and out of 3 made one, he again divided this whole into as many portions as was fitting. each portion being a compound of the same, the other, and the essence. So once again, we see this tripartite and distinction. And he proceeded to divide after this manner. We move on into the main part of this passage with the following instructions, let's say. So what I will try to offer here is my effort to reconstruct what is going on in the Timaeus dialogue in terms of the word soul and how it got created. So for a good reason, as we have seen from the prologue, we are talking about three parts. So I would like to ask from you to, if you want to, even take up your calculators on your smartphones and perform some calculations with me. We're gonna do some subtraction here, subtraction. So if we take the measure as being a multiple of 3, and then if we go into a clue from the laws, specifically, let me find the direct reference to share it with you. There is one exact line, the exact line is 737E from Plato's laws, where he mentions a specific number, 5040. Okay, and he keeps mentioning this number because it's a very interesting one. It has a lot of divisors, and it is considered as a highly composite number. And he uses it for various reasons. So what I've done here is that I've allowed myself to imagine a multiple, let's say, of that number, and then I divided that one by 3. So the whole, in this sense, and we're working backwards here, the whole will be 500,004 thousands, let's say, 504,000. So let's get back to the actual steps. Now, the first step, first of all, he took away one part of the whole. So we have this sum of 404,000, and we subtract from it half times 10,500. There is a good reason why I'm starting with the half. I think that is the trick that is missing here. So we make these subtractions and we proceed on the second step. Then he separated the second part, which was double the first. And as you can see, 10,500 is exactly the double of what we used for step 1. So we can now proceed in terms of subtracting even more from the whole. The step number 3 suggests that then he took away a third part, which was half as much again as the second, and 3 times as much as the first. Now, this is a bit tricky, but what it actually means, it means that he took away a third part, which was half as much as the second one. So he actually took half of what we took from step 2, which once again is the same one that is found on step on the first step. And then he multiplied that 3 times. So when you multiply the first step, let's say 3 times, you arrive at 1.5 times that measure, let's say, of 10,500. So we proceed to the next step. Then he took a fourth part, which was twice as much as the second. So once again, the second is 10,500, and we subtract another 2 times that from our whole. Moving forward on step 5, and a fifth part which was 3 times the third. Once again, 3 times step number 3, let's say, what we have used on step 3. It's gonna be 4.5 times that same measure. We continue with our subtraction and step 6, and a 6th part, which was 8 times the first. So 8 times this number here that we have used at our initial step, it means that we will get another 4 times our measure. Moving forward on step 7, and a 7th part, which was 27 times the first. So once again, because we started with a half measure, it means that we are gonna take 13.5 times that out of our whole. And for the last step, the instructions in the Timaeus says, after this, he filled up the intervals. And here he's mentioning about the double intervals and also the triple intervals. So this actually, when you make the calculations, it counts up into another 21 times our initial measure. And when you complete this algorithm, let's say, and all the 8 steps, you arrive at the remainder of 0. And thus, the whole mixture out of which he cut these portions was all exhausted by him. So pushing a bit further, just to give also some insights, let's say preliminary insights and some work I've done in terms of the next lines over there.
Paris?
Yeah.
1 or 2 minutes, maybe. We're already
Okay. Yeah. So just to summarize, we have 3 columns in this format, that they are all comprised by the same, the other, and the essence. Here I have these pairs, that they are pairs of prime numbers. Each line here sum up to our measure, that is 10,500. Each blue square sums up to this sum of 42,000, and in total for each column we have 168,000. And when you add all the 3 parts together, you arrive to this number for the whole, that it's the one we have used to perform our calculation. And because later on he says how he created this chiastic structure with the circles, this is how it actually falls into 3 different circles, with each quarter, let's say, summing up to exactly the same sum. And each pair is different, is distinct, but when you weight these 3, they all weight up the same. And all together, when you add them up, you arrive to the actual sum, let's say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harris. Have you solved the problem then? What do the numbers mean? What do they mean? Do they mean anything?
Yeah, actually, when you take this, let's say this recipe into consideration from Timaeus, and you try to exhaust the sum, it is like a puzzle or like an equation, let's say. So these are the numbers that this is the solution I found that actually works, basically. So that's my 2 cents on Plato and the Timaeus. And just to try to answer your question a bit, I think it represents the cycles of necessity, to put it in a poetic manner.
Jin is the mathematician also, so go ahead.
I wanted to ask how long it took for you to find those prime number pairs to sum up to 10,500.
When I found the interesting question, first of all, actually I'm a prime number aficionado, so and a number theorist. So as soon as I figure out the measure that I believe it's 105, it was very easy to do that. It just everything fall in order, let's say.
And do you think there's a reason? Are those the only? Have you exhausted all the prime pairs that sum up to 1,500?
No, I think that's a particular instantiation. I don't think I have exhausted it. What I have managed to do is I tried to make I actually tried to solve this as an actual puzzle. So I took primes that they ended in 3 and 7. So when you added them up together, they make 10. So that was an additional aspect. I tried to only use prime numbers that end in 3 and 7. And there are some very nice, let's say, elaborations and insights that can be gained by that particular example that I've managed to pinpoint down, because the balancing is a bit different. So you have two columns that they have exactly the same balance, let's say, of 3s and 7 prime numbers ending with 3 and 7, but you have the other in the middle that is a bit different. So that's also something interesting that I found.
Thank you. Anyone else? Maybe you could also work on this number, the 36 years, the world year in the Republic. At some point. Because that's unsolved, at least in the 19th century it was still. So maybe now you could enlighten us.
Okay. That would be great.
Harris, I would just like to say that's interesting. Oh, I'm sorry. That was really interesting how you did that. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to think about that for a little bit, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wendy, and everyone.
One thing that I remember doing, I'm no mathematician myself. I remember doing this course which is on geometry, and sort of it opened my eyes up to realizing seeing. So I just remember maths in school was just taught in a very much kind of formulaic way. My friend who's now doing like a PhD in maths, he just says that there is it surprised me, shocked me, there's a creativity and there's a contemplation in number and the forms of number. And do you feel like from like exploring that you feel like it has brought you more closer to the forms, more closer to contemplation of what is, rather than just being a mental abstraction, actually like in that deeper relationship?
Yeah, I always try to find the instantiation, let's say, of the ideal. So as it was discussed before with a question from Jin, I don't think this is the only solution, but at least it's one solution. So for what it's worth, I think it's somewhat of interest, let's say. Yeah. At least in the philosophy of mathematics and in terms of Plato. Yeah.
So Harris, this is Mike. I being a numbers person, I really appreciated what you had to say. One thing just crossed my mind, and I'm wondering what this would look like if we worked in a system that was not base 10. So what if we worked in like a hexadecimal system? I have no idea what it would mean or if it would mean anything, but
yeah. Very interesting in terms of primality and encryption. there are some particular encryption algorithms that they are widely used from our banking system to the cryptocurrencies, like the RSA algorithm, encryption algorithm. You can actually make it not only as a mathematical exercise, but it has some academic interest and some practical interest to take a prime number and turn it to another base. So you can use any different number of bases. A lot of them, they actually use the binary base, but you can actually do it in the octal and in the hexadecimal or any other base. So it will be interesting. What my intuition suggests is that this interlocking mechanism of the pairs of each pair, it will still be there. So it will be something interesting to explore.
Yeah, in the Hebrew Bible, there are, which is almost entirely myth, right? I mean, there's very little bona fide historic information, but within the myth, there are often very specific numbers. And so you're kind of stuck at some points in time. You read it and you know it's myth, and yet there's a very specific number, like the number 318 or something like that. And so you just sit there and you're like, okay, if this is myth, why is this number represented? I don't know the answer. It's just curious,
Yeah, it's very interesting. I find it extremely interesting that some numbers keep popping up in various ancient texts, and even in the Republic, we can see a lot of numbers. Like, for example, there is one passage that I remember that they reference a perfect number. So, and I don't think that when they state perfect number, it doesn't. We don't need to take it into with the modern mathematical number theoretical sense, because a perfect number is a number that has many divisors, and all of the divisors sum up, let's say, to the actual number. So I don't think this is what he means there. Instead, it's something like a philosophical inquiry into what perfection is, and what is the transcendentals and good and beauty and all the rest. So very interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Just very briefly before we continue, this one I mentioned briefly in one of the lectures. Just for anyone here and anyone watching this later on YouTube, Jacob Klein, Greek Mathematical Thought and the Origin of Algebra. And in John Burnett's, who is always highly recommended, John Burnett, and he was the Oxford editor of the collected works of Plato, Greek philosophy from Plato to Thales. Sorry, around from Thales to Plato. Or maybe backwards also. He goes into numbers and mathematical in Greek thought as well. Okay, so now something equally mad. Lizelle on theomania.
Yes, I want to share a passage from a letter that I wrote to a sacred sister of mine. It is jumping in at the beginning or in the middle of a conversation that's ongoing, and the conversation is very long, far from finished. So there's no conclusion. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But I would like to share just some part of it with you all. I sometimes feel as if we are tending to the dead body of salvation, my dear Lucy, without any hope that the stone table will crack. Maybe this is part of divine madness, to dream the impossible dream. So let us dance indeed, like the possessed. Let's dance to Plato. If I'm not mistaken, Plato speaks of myths as something along the lines of true lies. She, have spoken some time ago of the need for lies if we want to reanimate the divine. But we don't want to call it lies, do we? Because we love truth. But what about this? Not a lie, pseudes, but the need to speak that which is still concealed into unconcealment. Or to be more ritual-minded, to act that which is still concealed into unconcealment. I am thinking here, of course, of the Greek, as pointed out by Heidegger, truth as aletheia, as everybody says, or alethes, as I read the Greek myself, unconcealed, so true, real, as opposed to false or apparent. Speaking or acting that which is still hidden, still forgotten, into unforgottenness. Ritual and myth as a way to migrate over, no, through the plane of forgetfulness, lethe, Republic 621a, to the plane of truth, aletheia, Phaedrus 248b. To be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. Plato has Socrates saying that the poets, the myth makers, work by neither art, skill, techne, nor knowledge, episteme, but by divine inspiration or divine madness only, see ion. We need divine madness, quoting from Phaedrus again, 244a to b. In reality, the greatest blessing come by way of madness, indeed of madness that is heaven sent from the gods. The Greek is more literally translated as. It was when they were mad that the prophetess at Delphi and the priestesses at Dodona achieved so much for which both states and individuals in Greece are thankful. When sane, they did little or nothing. End quote. It is only to those touched by their madness that the gods reveal themselves. Now, Plato himself made myths. He must have known divine madness personally then. But did he work only in madness? Or did he employ art, techne, and knowledge, episteme, as well? I have to think it was the latter. And if so, how? How do we bind together reason, or logos, and divine madness? I think that we might have to find a way. Divine madness without logos is simply not, well, artful. And oh, who are we kidding? We do love knowledge deeply. I think that maybe there might be an answer found in sophrosune, and then specifically sophrosune as an orientation toward the good. Quote, judgment guiding us rationally towards what is best, from Phaedrus 327e, which we cannot have without the good revealing itself. I was thinking of Sophia Prunikos and how she was saved by the Logos, and how it might be a mythological way of marrying divine madness to reason. I do fear that the mad Sophia and the Logos do need to dance for there to be any hope to reach the unreachable star. But how? How do we lure them into the same ballroom? This, my dear Lucy, is our task.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Lucy, Lucia, Lux, light, Lucifer, light bringer. Yeah, the for Plato, the myth and logos. Yeah, you brought that out really well. So there could be a dialogue also between you and Wendy, I think, and your respective works. So, any questions by anyone? Comments, remarks?
So I think we'll all agree that was very beautiful. And the letter format was, I really enjoyed that format. That was very, very nicely done.
Thank you, Wendy. I just want to say, when you were speaking, I was also thinking we definitely could have a very fruitful dialogue between our two, the different texts we were looking at, maybe at the same thing. There was definitely a fruitful dialogue to be had there.
Yeah, I can see something like that.
Any questions? No? Or yeah, Jonathan?
I appreciate the imagery. It was very vivid in my mind when you talked about that dance between divine madness and logos. Trying to find that balance, trying to find that way in which, without that madness, without the myth, without the lie, that loses a spark as far as as what I heard you say. And without that, as you say, with Plato, about the logos, about the reason, the myth falls off an edge as far as I can gather. And I liked how there was no way of having to fully resolve it, but there was always that tension, and in that tension there needs to be that dance between the two. I don't know if there's a question there, but just in reflection and trying to piece together pieces of myself and regurgitate what I heard.
Lizelle, I liked your way of expressing the idea of a lie as bringing forward something that's been forgotten. I had a conversation with my brother not too long ago, and we made the statement that being a heretic is a very lonely calling. And when I heard you say that, I was like, yes, that's, there's so much that is forgotten that if you dig into it and learn it and you talk to someone else about it, they look at you like, you have two heads, or like you are mad. Like, why would you have these ideas? Where did they even come from? And then when you try to tell them, no, these are ideas that people had a long time ago. They're old ideas. They're not even, I didn't come up with them. And that just that idea that you're bringing something forward that was forgotten, but it is looked at as a lie because it's not the accepted truth. It's not the image that everyone is currently mimicking, and so it's very uncomfortable for them. But I just appreciated that imagery. Thank you.
Which is one good way, I think, of addressing or reading the so-called noble lie in the Politeia also. Taken out of context has given rise to many confused notions about Plato. Okay. Anyone else? Thank you for the comment, Nicholas. That was great to remind us on this also. Okay, then Chin. Thank you, Lizelle.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation so far. I want to apologize first because I haven't shored up all my thoughts into a coherent form. I haven't had the liberty of time. But just as Socrates, before trying to investigate what exactly the Kaiozunen was, gave a little prayer, I think that's appropriate for me too, before my presentation, so that I don't falter too much. And given this small space, I wanted to take the opportunity to recollect perhaps the text as a whole, the work Politeia, through the idea of paideia, through the notion of paideia. And paideia is it arises, the need for paideia arises at two distinct moments in the Politeia. I think initially in the training of the guardians, and later on in the question of the education of the philosopher. But the method by which these figures, perhaps an auxiliary guardian, and then the philosopher are educated, are in view of two distinct aims, ostensibly. For the guardian, it is to balance two aspects of the soul, the spirited and the rational, so that the spirited is in accord with the rational part of the soul, and so they are in harmony with each other. Whereas the philosopher is directed towards knowledge and therefore being. At least that's the equation that Socrates makes. I think within the work, a lot can be understood, or at least I've understood a lot, by trying to see how these two moments come together. And I think that is done through the 4 books, book 5, 6, 7, and 8. And these two moments are brought together in really what I consider quite an epic sequence of ideas, starting from book 5 and ending in book 8. So in book 7, Plato, or Socrates rather, does make the admission that the training of the guardians is done through habit and not knowledge. Knowledge really only arises as an issue in book 5. And the reason it does so is because Glaucon asks Socrates and makes a demand that Socrates show that the city can truly come into being, the Kallipolis, can truly come into existence. Up to now, well, the achievement so far really in the dialogue and the work is that the Kaiozunen has been grounded and that we understand what justice or appropriateness is in relation to what the polis is. And this is achieved really through through a form of paideia, which is habit, as Lizelle pointed out in her talk, or gave us perhaps a jumping off point to this point, which is that it is through the noble lie. But Socrates then says that the only kinds of individuals that can come to create the city, or come to bring the city into being, can allow the city to come into being, are philosophers. It is because they have sight of being. It's because they have access to being. The image that he uses is the ship of fools. If you remember this image, it's in book 6. You have the drugged ship owner. You have the quarrelsome sailors jabbering around, trying to arrogate power onto themselves, calling captain whoever is the best at persuading. And then you have this figure called a philosopher, or rather, sorry, I'm being a bit peremptory. I suppose they're called the true captain, who knows currents, the winds, the stars, and so on, everything, all the crafts that you need to be a proper captain. But the problem is that the philosopher is presented as a complete being. they are presented at the really at the apogee of their development in some sense. So although this is the image that Socrates first gives in response to the question of how the Kallipolis and therefore right education can come into being, it does not answer the question of how the philosopher comes into being. So the sequence keeps continuing on. These books, there's a inexorable movement to them, because we are then asked the question of how the philosopher comes into being. And Plato achieves this through an investigation of the conditions of knowing. First, through the sun analogy, then in an expansion of this image, the divided line, and a full grounding of this into the myth of the cave, as it's been called in discourse. The reason why education is integral to knowledge is that what is revealed through the process of education of paideia, because paideia must be or partake in periagoge, the turning of the soul towards the idea of the good. If we think back to the image of the cave, the myth of the cave, the prisoners are chained, looking upon the shadows upon the wall with a full persuasion that what they're looking upon are the real, true beings. It is only at the moment of turning that these images are seen to be dependent on a higher source, the inner light within the cave. I suppose this is a visual example of what later philosophers, or Hegel himself, will come to call sublation. But even in Plato's time, it's known that this is really the path of the dialectic, that it takes up the presuppositions and goes beyond them. And the path out of the cave is really this image of the working of the dialectic. So book 7 is the attempt to take this image and later on in discussion about the types of education to ground this image again in the very ways in which we come to apprehend the world and our conditions of knowing. And Plato uses really an example of how periagoge can work by picking up notions which are ostensibly quite simple, mathematical, quantitative perhaps. For example, the idea of the big and the small. Of course, if we stretch out our finger, we know that the middle finger is larger than our ring finger. But the ring finger is then larger than the pinky. So the ring finger partakes in both the large and the small. So we find that the objects of our apprehension to which we want to attribute certain qualities partake in both something in a certain quality and its opposite. And we sense, and we know, we come to understand that these qualities are really, they have a significance in the intelligible realm beyond our pure sensual or sensible apprehensions. At least this is my understanding of how Plato is trying to bring the idea of periagoge into really into a practical form, I suppose, in this sense. But eventually, we must face I suppose, the claim that was planted in the allegory, sorry, the analogy of the sun, which was the image that comes first in the sequence, that the sun, which is that with that which we understand or we gain understanding, is analogous to the idea of the good, and that it is also beyond being. The good, I think, is another concept. It could be a concept initially in our mind, just like the big and the small, that can undergo the same dialectical process has done the big and the small. The moment of pedagogy with respect to the concept of the good is, well, to try and rephrase, although the big and the small are like little toy examples, Plato is asking us to see how the dialectic could be done with the idea of the good. I think I'll now try and say why I think book 8 is integral to this.
Couple more minutes only.
Yes, I'll wrap up so that you don't have to continue to hear me rambling. I think book 8 is integral, is that book 8 shows us how various propositional notions of the good, which have not been suitably sublated, become coalesced within our various social formations. I think this is tantamount to really Plato claiming in some sense that our various constitutions, democracy, oligarchy, democracy and tyranny, are the shadows upon the wall created by a propositionalized notion of the good shining upon the very figures that are given to us really by nature. The other claim that Plato makes is that because these propositional notions of the good have not been suitably sublated, they undergo a process of decay. So going from democracy, you go down into oligarchy, you go down into democracy, and you go down into tyranny. And they are pulled apart because of a decay in education and the dialectic works its force upon these propositional notions of the good until it reaches really the base level of tyranny. And going back to the image of the ship of fools, I think that what that image is showing is really a case of a abortive philosophical education, where dialectic has not been installed in souls who have had paideia in both habit and knowledge. And the rowdy sailors who arrogate to themselves the title of a captain are the ones who practice dialectic without any idea of lawfulness or care or respect for the nomos of the cosmos. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jin. Excellent. It connects also to Andrew's talk, I think. Okay. Any questions, remarks, comments?
I'd like to comment on the last sentence of your presentation, Jin. The rowdy sailors that act without any idea of lawfulness or care with respect to the laws of the cosmos. That was a brilliant.
Yeah. Thank you, Dawson. And yeah, I wish I could have written it up and presented it in a more coherent format. Yeah, thank you.
Else?
Jen, I really enjoyed that. I particularly what perked my ears up was this idea of sublation, the similar, and I get the feeling that's part of the paideia, the lack of the paideia. You know, in other words, things aren't. I think you said the dialectic was not sublated. If I'm correct. Is that, in a sense, part of what's missing in the paideia? Am I getting that right? I don't know. You know, like in other words, the dialectic isn't assimilated into education properly.
Yeah, I think what from my reading, in book 7, Socrates says that dialectic must come last. And I think that if it comes too early, you end up producing the rowdy sailors. I think that's sort of the implication. And because I haven't written it up, there were many things I will touch on. For example, the fact that really Plato's vision is that there is this order within our soul, which is reflective of a certain of our political orders that we build or should be, and is reflective of a certain cosmic order. And so that whatever is appropriate or just is not some sort of vengeful happening from the gods, like some of the poets of his time would claim, but it is because it arises out of some disorder in the soul. So if you don't have the right paideia, if paideia is not focused on habit first, as the argument in the dialogue shows in the first 4 books, then the certain disorder in the soul, because each part has a desire and an end, a certain view of what the good is, I think our powers of language and rhetoric and poetry become used to justify those ends of those parts of the soul which are not placed into harmonious order with each other. And dialectic, when it's used by a soul which has not had this preliminary education, descends into a level, I suppose, of rhetoric, rather than being used as something that as an argumentative tool or tool to reach the idea of the good, which is something grasped in the contemplative mode of a soul that has reached a certain harmony within itself. And I think this is Plato's vision, which is trying to transmit through the Politeia.
Okay. Yeah, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that's very well said. Thank you.
Thank you. Tanati, do you have to, when do you have to leave? You can go next, that's fine. But how much time do you have?
Like 10 minutes more on this.
You have 10 minutes now?
Yeah.
Okay. Then the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just some short thing I wrote. The role of memory in the polis.
Excellent.
In the Politeia, at first glance, Plato is laying out the blueprint for the optimal form of government, the type of people who inhabit it, and the role they have to occupy in it, how to instruct the silver-souled guardians, how to conduct the bronze-souled majority, and the formation of the highest soul, the gold of the philosopher kings, and the necessity of education or paideia to reach his order. Taking this into account, the first 7 books might give the impression that Plato is dreaming of a perfect state of humanity. His Callipolis, beautiful city, looks like a sort of utopia. Once we get to book 8, however, this blind optimism is dispelled. Plato describes the types of governments that are found in the civilized world. The aristocracy, where the people with gold in their souls and love of wisdom rule. They have no love for wealth or power, only truth. The only form of government that follows the idea of appropriateness or justice. The government of Sparta, the democracy, where the power is concentrated in the guardians of the city as form of military regime, where the rulers are not guided by high ideals, but a strong spiritedness. The oligarchy, where the men who accumulate the most wealth are the ones ruling it and becomes the main focus of society. A disunited polis where all types of souls try to rule simultaneously give rise to democracy. Finally, is described the lowest form of government ruled by the very worst against the best, tyranny. These forms of governments are all stages of the city, going from aristocracy and degrading until reaching tyranny. This makes clear two things. First, the beautiful city is not the final goal that the philosophers work towards. On the contrary, even if the philosophers manage to build it, it will not be a stable equilibrium and end state of humanity as many utopian visions. Furthermore, even in the striving of the formation of the philosopher king, there is no intention to warn or prevent this degradation. Even though Plato sees how every stage produces the next degraded state, there is no call to protect the city and maintain its appropriateness and to prevent the bad actors with inferior souls to take over. This account is not the Callipolis and its enemies. For Plato, the decline is not the fault of any particular member of the city, but the natural course of a cosmic cycle. This means that the decay of the city is a matter of necessity, a sense of inevitability that will be similarly rediscovered by Oswald Spengler more than 2,000 years later. If Plato knows that it is possible to reach the idea of the good and appropriateness, then why will the polis inevitably turn against it? To deal with this question, first let's turn to Plato's notion of recollected knowledge or an amnesis. This is presented in the Phaedo dialogue. When discussing the concept of equality, Socrates posits that since we've seen in the world examples of equality that have some deficiency in its equalness, this brings us to think the idea of the equal itself. This thinking has to be a process of remembering if these sensible examples do not have the perfect equality, and they cannot be the source of our knowledge of the idea of the equal. Therefore, we must have that knowledge and bring it forward by remembering. The process of recollection makes possible to get to this idea of appropriateness of the good and to get to the aristocratic Callipolis in the first place. However, even if these ideas are present in the souls of and the cosmic order, they have to retreat and become unavailable. To understand how this occurs, we can find another example in the Meno dialogue that provides us a clue. Socrates here demonstrates the capacity of Meno's slaves to understand by himself some questions of geometry. At first, the boy answers quickly and gives the wrong answer. When his mistake is pointed out by Socrates, then the slave becomes astonished by this and with more difficulty reaches the correct answer. Just like in the Phaedo dialogue, the answer is not obtained by external forces, but by remembering. The main difference here, and the key to understand our initial question, is in that astonishment expressed by the slave. The slave starts with a series of beliefs or opinions, doxa, that express quickly and with no reflection. But after being confronted with his error, a new and more arduous process begins, and by the end, the incorrect beliefs are abandoned. Without this sense of astonishment, slaves and philosophers alike would not be able to engage in the process of recollection. The process of recollection indicates first an absence. The caste with the gold in their souls in the period of philosopher kings, the aristocracy, won't feel this lack since they have already achieved the highest stage. Therefore, the future generations will not be confronted with the need to remember the dikaiosune, the appropriateness of justice. Since this recollective is active, not being in awe of not having measure of appropriateness will result in a new breed of rulers who won't be dedicated fully to the idea of the good, and other aspects of the polis will begin to gain prominence, hence the decline. To explain better this process, let's go back to the myth of the cave, where the philosopher, according to Plato, is the one that steps out of the cave and is able to see not only what is, but also the shadows that he was watching along with his companions are seen finally for what they really are, And both his knowledge of the shadows and the idea makes him the ideal ruler, the philosopher king. Let's expand on this myth for a moment. Let's imagine the ideal philosopher king. He rules wisely, his laws are considered just, and his actions and edicts are admirable. The inhabitants of the city would take this philosopher king as the highest example of justice and appropriateness. When confronted with what would be just in this or that situation, they would point out to their king or their laws that they were written during his reign. The inhabitants of the Callipolis would not be thinking on the concept of justice itself, but on the king and his laws. In the future, the representatives of the state that would be considered the wisest and most admired would be the ones that could recite from memory all the laws written by the king, or were able to tell from memory anecdotes of the king. For any problem that arises regarding governance, the wise men would be called up and they would recite perfectly, according to Article X, Section Y, Paragraph C, this, and this. Or this is just like when our beloved king had to deal with this or that situation, and he said and this and that and so on. The law speakers in this scenario are eerily similar to some of the most celebrated dwellers of the cave. Let's remember that when the philosopher returns to the cave, notice the absurdity of the games played inside, where some of the prisoners are able to memorize the sequences of shadows and can recite them, getting in return prizes for their extraordinary ability. The philosopher king that has superior knowledge of the shadows, ironically, ends up leaving the trail of shadows that would lead up to the forgetting of appropriateness and the idea of the justice, supplanted by pure imitation. The philosopher king, in the role informing the Callipolis, plants the seed of the city's decline. It's important to mention that every stage still holds some measure of justice and beauty, even in the last and most deteriorated stages. There is the most beautiful tapestry of every member of the polis during the period of democracy, and it's the period of greatest freedom. And when that freedom becomes unbearable, you can see the tyrant with all its distorted values still holds some measure of beauty in his soul. The forgetfulness of the polis leads to the end of each system, making the appearance of the next inferior state the externalization of this forgetfulness that leads to error. The warriors forget how to control the accumulation of money. The oligarchs forget how to appeal to the desires of the demos. Then demos forgets how to live in freedom, and the tyrant forgets how to control his desires, even forgets his place in the cosmos, putting himself above the gods. This degeneration generates an astonishment so great that it demands finally the effort of recollection to call on the muses and their mother, the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne. What type of memory is it necessary to think the idea proper then, to be able to remember the order of the Callipolis? As we already established, memory contains forgetfulness by giving place to mimicry and memorization. To give the illusion of that idea once attained is always give the illusion that the idea once attained is always available. In the modern age of techniques, one could imagine this manifesting not as a formation of memorious statesmen that remember the law and the philosopher king, but in machines with great computational capabilities, where all supposed correct answers are retrieved from vast datasets, but incapable of authentic speculative thinking, the electric sophist, so to speak. Instead, the memory that has to be cultivated is the one that leaves pictorial examples behind. The idea of the good and all that is derived from cannot be exhausted. It is already in the order of the cosmos. This means that it cannot be reduced to one single instance of good governance by a philosopher king. It also means that it is not lost during the worst periods of tyranny. That is why even the tyrant can appear as beautiful at times. To recollect is to attune yourself to the sense of having forgotten what is, to recognize in each stage what has been lost and what will be recovered. To build a beautiful city at the same time is to leave it behind. Thank you.
Excelente.
Gracias.
That was fantastic. Fantastico. I think the best one also so far. I will link for everyone who's listening to this on YouTube and everyone here. I will link to Natut's collected essays, which is published on our website, and also to one of the recordings. This ties in very well, I think, with what Jin was saying also. Okay, do you have time to take questions, or are you just...
Just one quick question, if they have some. If not,
anyone, anything? One? Mark,
okay.
Before he has to leave. Yeah?
Okay. Okay.
I think you have to leave, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right, then we leave the discussion for another time. Ravi, then Nick. Where's Ravi? He just went dark. And now he's disappeared. I don't know why. Did he say anything? It looks like it may have been something wrong with this computer there. I don't know. Well, okay, Nick, why don't you go? And then let's hope that Ravi comes back.
Okay. Should I stop if he comes back or just continue?
No. It's
okay.
Floor is yours. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So this is another essay that I cut short for this presentation. But I guess I'll send you the full draft when I'm done with this. So what kind of city would women build? What would his politics look like? And what would be the fate of philosophy in such a city? These are pressing questions today, ones that first came to my attention during my time in graduate school. Here I witnessed a rejection of an ideal that I believed necessary to discover truth and knowledge, a devotion to open inquiry and rational debate, facilitating a fair and open battle of ideas. This ideal was subordinated to the demands of the ideology of diversity, which took on a stereotypically feminine character. Proponents said they were practicing love, compassion, and inclusion, and that open discussions on important topics such as race and sex would hurt the community. I came to wonder if such a battle of ideas was fundamentally possible within a feminine political order. While such a battle is gender neutral in theory, the practical dynamic necessary to bring it into being may not be. To better understand our contemporary situation, we must raise two sets of fundamental questions. First, on the fundamental nature of philosophy, and specifically on the relationship between philosophy and politics. Second, on the fundamental difference between men and women, and specifically how they differ as philosophers or thinkers, as political actors, and in their effects on the interplay of politics and philosophy. How can Plato's Republic help us raise these questions? Plato's works are deeply concerned with the relationship of the philosophers to the political community. They address this relationship explicitly through the cave myth, for example, as well as implicitly through Socrates, whom we always encounter in complex dialogues with members of the political community. The gravity of Plato's consideration is underscored, of course, by the fate of Socrates, whose philosophic activity led to his execution by the city of Athens. There are several approaches we can take to investigate the questions on sex differences. We can ask how the two sexes are treated in the Republic, on the different roles men and women play in the city and speech, for example. We can look at masculine and feminine concepts in the text. Masculine concepts include courage, while feminine concepts include dikaiozune and philosophia, as well as Ananke and her three daughters, the three fates that arise in the myth of air. Or, as I do here, we can ask what would be the effect of substituting men for women, either as interlocutors in the dialogue or as political actors in the city and speech. Here I will investigate Socrates' taming of Thrasymachus in Book 1. In this exchange, I see Thrasymachus as representative of politically and philosophically destructive masculine excess, evidenced by his belligerent behavior and his argument that justice is the advantage of the stronger. In taming Thrasymachus, Socrates makes the dialogue safe for philosophy. In this, I see the lesson that the philosopher must be able to tame a certain kind of masculine excess to make the city safe for philosophy, as well as a fundamental means by which he can accomplish this. Flipping the sexes, I ask if a similar dynamic could play out in a dialogue among women. What is characteristic of politically and philosophically destructive feminine excess? What female character would embody it? Would the philosopher be able to tame this excess, and by what means? Touching back to the contemporary situation, I see the university and the nation is dominated by a feminine excess that we do not yet understand how to tame. How can this thought experiment on the Republic help us with our situation? And conversely, how can our situation help us better understand the relationship between the philosopher and the political community? So I'll now describe the manner in which Socrates tames Thrasymachus in a little bit of detail, and in the full essay, I go on for a lot more, but I'll cut it to about 3 or 4 paragraphs for this presentation. So when they begin, Thrasymachus is furious at Socrates for merely refuting others rather than providing his own answer of what the just is. He enters the dialogue in a burst of belligerence. He had been restrained by the other men many times before speaking. Then, hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. He frightens the other men. He shouts at Socrates. He demands Socrates suffer a punishment or pay a fine if he is unable to answer. He calls Socrates disgusting. Moreover, Thrasymachus puts forward a vulgarly masculine view of justice, that the just is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger, and that it is more profitable to do injustice than justice. However, crucially, Thrasymachus' aggression is accompanied by higher desires that the philosopher is able to exploit. Thrasymachus desires honor and a good reputation, particularly a reputation for wisdom, which he aims to acquire by means of his art, the art of rhetoric. His desire for honor is higher than his base desire for destruction, but lower than the desires that motivate the other men. It is lower than the desire to know how best to live that motivates Glaucon and the others, and it is still lower than the desire for truth and knowledge of what the just is that motivates Socrates. Thrasymachus' desire for honor and the manner in which honor is dispensed by the male community forces him to take 2 steps that initiate his taming by the philosopher. First, he must voluntarily curtail his aggression. While ad hominem attacks on Socrates may satisfy his base desires, they will not win him honor from the other men. Second, he must step into the arena of argument with Socrates, opening himself up to the philosopher's inquiry and rules of reason that will be enforced, even if imperfectly, by the spectators. Immediately after providing his answer, Thrasymachus demands praise from Socrates. But honors from Socrates and the others cannot be won so easily. Thrasymachus cannot merely make an assertion. He must support that assertion with persuasive speech. Yet a seemingly persuasive monologue, as he delivers near the middle of his exchange with Socrates, will not do either. Surprisingly, he intended to lead the discussion after concluding his monologue with a reassertion of his initial position on the just. We don't know why he wanted to leave. He may have believed that his initial position had been thoroughly proven, thus winning him a good reputation, or he may have recognized that winning such a reputation would not be possible with Socrates present, which seems more likely. Either way, the others force him to stay put and present an argument for what had been said. The group will award honor for speech only if it can stand up to rigorous questioning. The group thus forces Thrasymachus into a direct and comprehensive confrontation with Socrates, something that Socrates likely could not have accomplished on his own. So I'll cut the discussion of Socrates and Thrasymachus right there, and then move on to the question of substituting the masculine for feminine or the males for females in this dialogue. So I'm not going to actually do the substitution, just ask some questions about it. Would a dynamic play out among a group of women? Some questions we can ask are, what base feminine desire is the counterpart of masculine aggression? And how would it manifest itself among a group of women? What higher desire would accompany it in a woman? Would she desire to win a good reputation among other women? Would this be a reputation for being wise, as was the case for Thrasymachus among the men? Or rather for something else, like being loving and caring? How would she win this reputation? Must her reputation for love be won in a fundamentally different manner than a reputation for wisdom? Would the group's demand for direct confrontation with the philosopher, which was so essential to Socrates' taming of Thrasymachus, then disappear? Or is there some fundamentally different dynamic by which the philosopher's taming of feminine excess would have to play out? Would thinking this through reveal something fundamental about the differences between the sexes, particularly as it relates to the interplay of politics and philosophy?
Done. Are you? Is it?
Yeah.
Done?
So I just want to
okay, that's something I have to teach all of you. Just to say thank you very much at the end, because at least you hit your keyboard, you know, because I kind of I'm done. But okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. Very interesting.
Nick, I have a question for you. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. I appreciate your boldness. Let's say that you were to consider this intrapsychically. And so by that, I mean, in a Jungian framework, the feminine aspect of a man is the anima, and the male aspect of a woman is the animus. And so if you reframe this in terms of an internal dialogue, trying to balance yourself out, how would this change anything that you've put forth?
Yeah, so I haven't thought about that. So you're saying, like, I guess I don't know the Jungian concepts, but that like men have a feminine side and women have a masculine side, so to speak.
I mean, it's, it's 120 years old, right? Or 100 years old. But so if you could say that men have a feminine side to them, which arguably might be more driven to the arts, maybe more driven to the literature, perhaps more caring and more sensitive, whereas the animus or the more masculine part of a woman might be more inclined to be courageous, or could be more focused on reason, on logic. And I say this in light of how incredibly different things are today than they were 100 years from now.
Sure. So I guess the thing that I took from like reading Plato is that, so I think the aspects of the individual do matter. Like a woman could be courageous, for example, but kind of what I was getting at here is really the interplay with the political community. So it's like Thrasymachus isn't just an aggressive person. It's like he wants to win honors from the others. So it really depends on how he looks to the others. And I think in a lot of Plato's dialogues, that really comes through. Like he never, or at least not to my knowledge, presents anything that's not in a dialogue form. So the way and the manner people are saying things and why they're saying things and why they're not saying other things does matter. And I think that that's kind of what I had looked at. And I think this idea of like, maybe like there can be isolated individuals that have certain characteristics, but that kind of the mean among the community has this huge effect on that person, like their reputation and all of that. So kind of what I was trying to bring out in this analysis is like, what are the essential aspects that go into this taming with Thrasymachus? And I only got into a little bit of that in here. And actually the next part that I was going to read that I didn't have time to was that Socrates actually, so there's a part after Thrasymachus delivers his monologue where he's going to leave. And Socrates, so the others first of all like force him back, and then Socrates kind of gives this speech to him where he says, like, do you not care for us? Like, you say that you know how best to live and what the just is, and do you not have any concern for us about that we'll live a worse life? So I thought it was really interesting that it was like a surprisingly feminine dynamic where he traps Thrasymachus in and then is able to basically work him over, for lack of a better term, and then tame him by the end.
Thank you.
Very good exchange. Anyone else on Harris? You posted something in the chat. Yin and Yang.
Yeah, basically this discussion, not only in terms of the Jungian animus and anima, but also in terms of Nick's presentation there. I think it is one of those symbols that actually captures that aspect of the feminine and the masculine that are interrelated, let's say, in a profound manner.
Yeah, I guess one other thing that I would say is, so like there is like a necessity to have this, I think, strong masculine and I guess maybe also strong feminine character, which we don't have, to my knowledge, anywhere within the Platonic dialogues. And like Thrasymachus, like one thing that he actually brings to the conversation is he brings this idea of the just that other people would not really be willing to make in their own names. Like it's a very vulgar thing to say it's the advantage of the stronger and that injustice is superior to or more profitable than justice. So it's almost like you have to embody this belief in order to present it and bring it to the philosophic dialogue. So it's almost like even the others who are not women themselves, like Glaucon, could not even present this argument in the way that Thrasymachus has done. So I think it's also, as I try to ask here, like what would a woman be able to bring in and represent, like truthfully, into this discussion that like a man might not be able to?
I'd be curious what you've written further out, because that speech you're saying, have you explored what that looked like, or is it those are more the questions that you put at the end to kind of contemplate, and then you've kind of delved deeper in your further exploration?
Yeah, so I had started exploring it, but I didn't have time for this this essay, and so really what I wanted to do is say what is the relationship between the philosopher and political community that Thrasymachus and Socrates exchange shows. So I think it's more complex than what I said here, which is basically just that the community can persecute you and you need to be able to tame them. So there's a lot more lessons within that. And I guess kind of what I was trying to say is that there is this complex dynamic that goes on between them. And then when you think about substituting women for men, even just which things become questionable, like which things do you need to raise as a question? And I guess I kind of did look at that where I said, like, would a woman want to be seen as wise among other women, or would you rather be seen as loving? And I think then it's, and again, this is not even like exceptional women. So I think it's another important point is like, it's not, I guess like the gold souled women that might have these desires, but it's like, I guess Thrasymachus might be a silver souled person. So, but no, I haven't really looked into that substitution. It's really trying to raise the question of what that would look like. And I guess even trying to reflect back on the method, which is something else that I was working on before this presentation.
I see what you mean. The dynamic, like if you just take upon, as you say, Thrasymachus amongst all these other men, he is in some sense both trying to impress him as a sophist and is also then kind of shamed in some sense, and well, not shamed, but he feels self-shame when he's like wants to leave, or either that he's like, okay, I don't want to be beaten by there's almost a pride in Thrasymachus and where he acts and the way the interplay is amongst the other men. So yeah, I see. I mean, like the fact that the dynamic is different because he's amongst his peers in some ways. And what would that play out if it was reversible? If it was amongst other women, or what happens if other people were involved in that dynamic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another thing I was going to consider is like if there's then a mixed dynamic, then that just adds a whole nother layer of complexity where it's like, what reputation does a man want among other men? What reputation does he want among other women? And similarly for women. So I think that doing this analysis kind of brings that idea of the reputation to the fore, which then lets me raise these questions on the effect of that on gender. So I guess kind of what I was taking from this exchange is that it reveals some fundamental relationship between the philosopher and the political community, and the questions that arise from that are the things that we need to consider when we look at the difference of the sexes.
Yeah, and I guess it's also like different ways of status showing, and whether, because yeah, Thrasymachus is trying to show his status through his arrogance and his way of just coming in like a bull in a china shop, just kind of bashing in and saying, "Look, I'm gonna shoot him down and show it like one-upmanship," and that is how he would present it. But as you say, like the political dynamic with the philosopher would appear differently, may appear differently with a different status dynamical interplay.
Right. Yeah, and like Wendy was saying that it's more about soul development than that is determinative than male and female. So yeah, I think that was a interesting thing about Plato's Republic is the way that it treats the sexes. That like I had mentioned early in the essay, that there's a lot of different ways we can approach this question, and like those are two different ways. And then what I presented here was kind of this thought experiment as a different way to approach it. But I do want to consider everything holistically.
I really appreciate what you've done.
There's briefly in Homeric and Homer's times, honor is very much understood as it would be in, I guess, democracy, as something external. So the geras, that's the word in Greek. I pronounce it poorly, of course. The honor gift or so is for example, for Achilles is a young girl, and when Agamemnon steals that girl, Achilles loses his honor. So I don't know why my parents gave me the name Achilles, but one of the many Greek names that I have to carry, because that's just one of you only know 2 of 4 of my names. I won't relate the others, but they're all Greek. But with what you can see in Plato is not first, but maybe one of the first movements towards interiority, which wasn't so important before. Okay, so Wendy, did you want to speak up, because you did unmute yourself briefly there for a minute?
I just wanted to mention in Plato, because at the end we have the basically reincarnation of souls. So the souls will carry many lives with them, and that's what you lose when you go through drink the water of the river of forgetfulness. You lose your, but it still resonates as a memory. So, I mean, I'm not, my initial instinct was a pushback on delineating specifically in Plato a masculine feminine motif, because I don't really see it, but I understand what's being said, but I just think that there's more associated with the soul that he's looking at than the characteristics of the sexes. But in that particular passage that was read, you could see it that way, but to me it's still it's referencing that type of soul development, and not so much that it's masculine. You know what I mean? Because when I read it, I didn't read masculine. I don't, because that didn't resonate with me, because I'm a woman, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, I think that you can read things. I don't know. That's just my thoughts. I just don't. I don't see that as I feel like that you could go astray if I feel like that, maybe a tangent or something. I don't. Yeah, I just, because it's clearly stated in the myth of her where, some people didn't want to come back as a woman, when it came back as a swan. And, but the idea that your soul is eternal, and you carry everything that you gain from your past lives with you, but you don't remember it specifically, apparently. That's something I wanted to explore because they don't drink
Yeah.
enough water to completely forget. They just drink enough water to slightly forget. You know? Anyhow, that was all I was getting at.
Yeah, so I think the way that like gender or sex is this difference of the sexes is actually treated within the Republic is an important question, and that's not something that I had honed in on. So definitely trying to come up with like a holistic picture is important, and like the examples that you brought up, I think were important, and I guess just trying to think of how that plays out of like the different types of souls. Like I guess if Thrasymachus is like the silver souled person, then maybe that's like that doesn't resonate like as strongly with him. Like this idea of like having this balanced duality of the masculine and feminine.
Yeah, I just think that the the aggression or what you would associate with masculine should just be aggression. Full stop. It doesn't have to be then associated to masculine. You know, so I don't see Plato associating. So in other words, that particular soul is aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. You know what I mean? That's part of that, that because there's all the differentiations with the, with the line and I mean, it's all in there, the passions and the aggressions and all of that. That's all part of the soul, the soul, the whole, and there's a oneness to the soul and an eternalness to it that, so I don't know. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I just,
Yep. Yeah.
you might, I just don't see it going male female so much in Plato. I see it as
well, but
okay.
So we've spent a lot of time on this now, but I would say that there is something to it because obviously, so Diotima is one of the female teachers of Socrates. I think that's significant. So Ananke is female and her 3 daughters that Nick mentioned. So you have feminine principles, and I would say feminine and masculine. So that's there. The danger of such a project is, and that's why I would agree with what you say, Wendy, is that it lends itself to psychologizing and going out on a bit of a tangent and then losing it. So that's one has to be very strict and very close to the text rather than making contemporary associations. I think one has to stay on what it is that was particularly just because of the dikaiosyne is another feminine principle, I would say. And that's significant. I mean, that's what's lost in the English language is because you no longer have any articles. It's just the sun, the moon. Terrible. Il sole, la luna in Italian. Or as the Italians always point out to me, it's terrible that the Germans say die Sonne, which is female for the sun, and der Mond, a male sun, a male moon. That's to them is terrifying. But those sex differences are significant in the language, and they speak to a principle or different principles. So that was a very good exchange. But we do want to get Ravi. Are you? Can you speak?
Yes, I think I'm back on now. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, very well, actually.
Great. Cool.
So the grid is down.
Yeah, I had this heard a transformer or something going out with lightning just the moment before. Yeah, it was really weird. But I'm back on with my iPhone.
So you last but not least, do you want to turn on your camera or do you want to?
No, I don't have any lighting in my room, so I'll keep my camera off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for all the talks so far. They were great. My talk is called The Phenomenology of Nihilism and Access to the Good in the Individual and the Collective. In Book 6 of Plato's Politeia, Socrates introduces the idea of the good by showing that the good is the idea that all the many separate good things of the world take part in. Quote, "We say there are many beautiful things and many good things, and the same with everything else. That is how we classify them in speaking of them.
We also say there is a beautiful itself and a good itself, unquote. There are hints throughout the text as to what this good is, though we must keep in mind that it is not ultimately reducible to any formulation. In Book 10, Socrates says that, quote, what corrupts and destroys is always the bad, whereas what saves and preserves is the good, unquote. It is convincing to the speakers in the time of the ancients that there may be such an idea of good that unites the diverse manifestations of goodness. The idea does not only unite, but rather serves as the anterior condition for any individual manifestation of the good. But modern man is skeptical of this claim, and the objection initially turns on the ontological status of the principle of the good. Modern man is comfortable with invisible ideas that underlie the world of form, but only if they are laws of physics, mathematical formulas that predict the behavior of matter at all times and places. The ontological status of those laws is not questioned and is seen as irrelevant, because they serve the function of knowledge, prediction, and control. The idea of the good is not a mathematical law, and it does not have any predictive value, so it cannot be understood by the modern mind in that way. If the good is not a law like the law of physics, there is nothing else it can be to the modern mind, since this mind does not admit anything else into its ontology. The scientific metaphysics prevalent in the Western world since Descartes, though taking a step beyond Descartes, argues that matter is the ultimate reality and that mind is an epiphenomenon of matter. Here, goodness is not a property of the ultimate reality of matter, but is rather part of the world of subjective values, preferences, and normative notions of ethical development. The subjective world is only able to touch the objective world when mediated by the attempt at science known as psychology. In this paradigm, goodness is measured supposedly objectively by subjective reports of well-being, which in general equate to reports of pleasing psychological circumstances. Even though this split of the objective and subjective attempts to preserve the possibility of human values in a valueless material world, downstream of this metaphysics is nihilism. If the ultimate reality of the world is that life is a random product of the random motions of valueless matter, then there is no purpose to human life and a nihilism results. With the background assumption of nihilism induced by the general culture's metaphysical assumptions, the phenomena of goodness are therefore not simply given as they were during Plato's time. Thus, it turns out that there is in fact another ontological problem with the idea of the good for moderns, coming in before even generalizing from the good phenomena to the idea of the good. The ontological issue being securing access to the phenomena of the good in the first place. But the disclosure of the good to the soul is prior to the nihilistic interpretation. Nihilism says that even if there was a good, it wouldn't matter, but it only says that in response to the prior disclosure of the good. As we mentioned earlier, one locus where the good is disclosed is the case of that which saves and preserves. When the doctor saves a life, that is an event that takes part in the idea of the good, as the doctor has performed an action that saves and preserves the life of the patient. Nihilism, though, would assert that even a medical miracle is not truly good if the life that was saved has no value, and that life in general has no value because it is the mere assemblage of valueless atoms and electrons. Yet this does not mean that nihilism and the good are somehow on an equal footing. We must pay attention to the phenomenology of nihilism to see this. Nihilism forcefully presents its idea of the valuelessness of life, and that causes a black cloud to fall over the soul. But anterior to the descent of nihilism is an instinctive valuing, a deep joy at the saving act of the doctor, regardless of any argumentation about the value of the action. With this in mind, the ground of access to the good can be restored even in the presence of the nihilistic way of thinking and feeling that is prevalent today. This anteriority of the good can be related to Heidegger's insight in Being and Time that the significance of the world with its objects and relations is in fact prior to the interpretation of the world as mere presence at hand, or matter viewed as merely spatially extended, mathematically analyzable and valueless matter. Nihilism's judgment that the world is valueless is, similarly, an interpretation that comes after the instinctive recognition in the soul of what is good. Nor should this disclosure of the good be interpreted as merely subjective. Following Heidegger, we see that the significance disclosed by this primordial interpretation comes before the split of the world into objective and subjective. For Plato, of course, we do not want to stop at unreflective instinct when considering the good. We want to ascend beyond instincts, beyond individual instances, to grasp the good in itself, beyond its particular manifestations.
Still, this step of noticing the good as revealed to the soul's intuitive or even instinctive judgment prior to the nihilistic interpretation is necessary in our age, because without it, the nihilistic interpretation would convince us to pass over the possibility of the good entirely. This primordial reinterpretation of life, with a view towards the disclosure of the good, need not immediately have us recast our ontology. Even if scientific materialism was the correct deduction for reason to make, the good would still be disclosed to the soul, and it would be the soul's choice to see through nihilism to let itself see the good. Thus, while many may find that the disclosure of the good has implications for their ontology, we see that the good can be seen regardless of one's ontological understanding, provided that one is willing to see through the haze of nihilism that has wrapped itself over our age. Scientific metaphysics makes us question the possibility of the good for the individual by splitting the objective and subjective. Similarly, the current secular political order, which attempts to govern society rationally, splits the individual from the collective and gives up on the possibility of the collective good. Questions of public life under rationalistic liberalism are in principle governed by objective reason, leaving supposedly subjective matters such as pursuing the good up to private individuals and associations. This means that it is not possible to pursue the good at the level of the entire society. It is little wonder that there is such widespread nihilism about our collective purpose. Yet the entire text of the Politeia makes it clear that the good is not merely an individual question. The good for the individual can only come about if they are balanced within themselves and find their place within the entire city. The good for the entire city only comes about if its individuals and classes find their right place and contribute to the well-being of the whole. The neutrality towards the good of the current order can be seen in one way as a manifestation of nihilism, but we can also choose to see the good in it. The tolerance of different ideas and modes of life that is present at least in classical versions of liberal thought certainly takes part in the good. Technology, for all its chaotic and disruptive tendencies, has brought about gains in connection and productivity, and even if these are not the only things to be valued, it does take part in the good in that way. Even if the current governing paradigm refuses to see itself as valuing the good, we can always choose to interpret it as a partial good that is still playing its role as the meeting of the many and the one, that may eventually be restored to its full potential as a Callipolis in time. Thanks. That's the end.
Excellent. Thank you, Avi. It's addressing a lot of what we've been hearing tonight and ties it all back to the importance of the good. So thank you.
This is Mike. I'll break the silence. Ravi, I thought that was really, I found your presentation and your discussion very easy to follow. It was very well written, I thought. And I wasn't tempted to look away. And so I want to thank you for that. I admit I can't resist the temptation to, when I hear, about the idea of nihilism, and when we think about that, or we talk about the idea of it, or the idea of the good, I was quickly brought back to one of the concepts that I learned in psychology for infants. And so there's a notion called annihilation anxiety. And so the thought of, this isn't the same thing, but what it makes me think about, the idea of annihilation anxiety is that there's an infant that is actually not really anything yet, because he or she does not have a formed psyche yet, which is why they call it the fourth trimester. And there are some individuals, or some children, of course, that are not well cared for because they don't have, as some psychologists would call the good enough mother. It is an idea of a basic need. So the idea of annihilation anxiety is basically a quivering infant that isn't really aware of its own existence, but is aware that it is nothing in that sense. It's an absolute sort of horror. And so when I think and I feel about the idea of nihilism, in one sense, I wonder if it's freeing, to know that there could be no meaning. On the other hand, what I wonder about is it horror? So I don't have any reason behind what I'm, talking about right now, but it's almost why I gravitate towards the idea of the good, because the idea of nihilism is horrific. I know that's not an academic response, but
We don't
your
need any
parent
of those here.
talking about them is really helpful to me personally. I liked it very much.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think there's really something to this idea that nihilism and some of these responses that we're having to our current situation are psychological. But I think even in like the psychological, there's always a philosophical aspect, and so I think there might be something to the idea that nihilism might be the result of some sort of early childhood trauma or something like that. But at the same time, there are philosophical issues that still need to be questioned and don't necessarily go away just by solving a psychological issue. That's my experience, at least. But yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that is definitely relevant, though.
Thank you.
Dawson? Or Andrew? Andrew was first, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it reminded me, thanks very much, Ravi, that was really fascinating. In many ways, you expressed a bit what I was trying to put across when I was talking about Derrida and Levinas. It seemed to me, you mentioned, what I found interesting was when you said that even without ontology, there's an inkling of the good, which I thought was great. I think in that way also, I said that Levinas was slightly more, was more positive than Derrida. But without ontology, it was just an inkling of something positive, an inkling of the idea of the good. And I also wonder in a way, Derrida is justified or understandable by his saying that, as you said, if all there is science, if language is just science, if it's just semantics, syntax, if we can just categorize it, there's nothing wonderful about it. There's nothing mystery about what's written. So yeah, without the ontology prior to science, prior to scientific way of looking at language, then I think we do lose the idea of the good. And I think you put that across very well. Maybe the only solution really is a rediscovery of people like Plato. I know in history there have been periods where the Greek has been valued and times when it's not been valued. And I think the last, since the war really, since Karl Popper decided Plato was a fascist and was probably responsible for World War II, even though he lived 2,500 years before it. Plato and the Greeks have gradually become less and less fashionable. So maybe we really do need to do that to rediscover the idea of the good.
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Andrew. Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the works of Derrida or Levinas, so I can't comment on those. But yeah, when I was trying to resolve this question of the good and its current relation to our way of thinking, yeah, the place to go did seem to be the experience of it or the phenomenology of it, and kind of uncovering it in its actual in our actual experience, that seemed to be the only way to kind of recover, coming back into contact with it in the same way that Plato seems to be talking about it.
It seems that in many ways, the idea of the good now is just making everything equal. But that's maybe not. If there's no underlying idea of the good, if the underlying idea of the good is just nihilism, then what are we equalizing, you know?
Jin? Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. And I really liked what you said about the fact that people are only now meant to practice good in private. And that makes me think of the a state of institutions in our times. And I think that perhaps it's not the forces are perhaps even more corrosive, because it's not just that people are left to practice, or institutions are left to practice in private. It's that if they want to have any part in public life, then they're evaluated according to financial metrics. So the way of seeing them is through a purely numerical lens, support a certain system. I was wondering then if you had visions of perhaps how these private explorations can root themselves in the public sphere, such that perhaps they can grow into fulfilling institutions. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the applied side of it is just the same thing that many of us are trying to do anyway, just pursuing whatever one's own vision is of the good in a. I think that the current paradigm that we have to work within is this distinction between the public and the private. And I don't know if there's any private action that you can take that's going to be able to overcome that paradigm. So Johannes has the idea for Halkyon Guild, and he has to enact that as a private organization. And so we're free to participate that as private individuals. So I don't have a clue as to how that distinction is going to be overridden. But as private individuals, our only possibility right now is to work within that paradigm. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a better solution at the moment, but I think there's a lot that can be done still within that scope. And I think what I was trying to get at the end of the talk was the idea that even if the public paradigm is interpreted even if it is in reality valueless, that can still be interpreted as a step towards the good in itself, in the sense that the valuelessness is a positive vision of stepping away from negative values. So negative values of different kinds of tyranny or oppression, our valuelessness is an attempt to step away from that tyranny and that oppression. And maybe in the future, we'll be able to figure out a more positively valueful notion. But I think at the current time, the private public distinction of good is what we have to work with.
Thank you. Can I just say what Jin just said points out something very important. So we have, those of you who work in corporate jobs, as you know, you have, you are evaluated on the basis of your performance. So there's a hint of the good, but it's a nihilistic reification of the good. And the trouble in the 21st century is that we don't even have the beautiful romantic fin de siècle pessimism or nihilism of the 19th century. We don't even have a horrible nihilism. None of it. We have no artists who express it. We have no poetry that could express it. We have to, those of us who still have anything left that would resemble a soul, they have to go to the 19th century. They have to read Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and maybe the early 20th century, like Camus, because there's no one here who expresses this. And so it's a sort of a technocratic nihilum. But still, the good is there as a performance enhancement, perfection, but it's so far from human perfectibility in the sense of even a Humboldt still in the idea of Bildung. Now, as Halkyon was mentioned briefly, and Nietzsche is already in the room, Halkyon, obviously the English pronunciation would be more properly Halcyon days. You may have heard of this expression. Why is it called Halcyon days? This refers to the kingfisher, the ice bird, Halkyone, that breeds around winter solstice when the sea is still for about 2 weeks. So this bird gives new life in between tempest, in between in during the cold, etc. So Nietzsche speaks towards the end of his awake life, not often, but sometimes, of the Halkyonische Melodie or the Halkyonische Ton, or wir Halkyonia. He speaks of we Halcyonians. They already hear this other melody of the future. Okay. Or whoever wants to speak. Now, Ravi, you can, you've responded to Chin, I think. So is anyone else who wants to say something? Yes?
Yeah. I'd say that one thing that I did not even think, like, I appreciate Ravi of your talk, is I didn't quite recognize the fact that, as you said, of Descartes, that the good slowly became something that was way in which it was part of the forms, and as you say, it's a phenomenon, phenomena, and then it kind of fell down into subjective, objective, and it became into the subjective, and then the good became like the sense of the feelings and the way in which it was a metric of, are you feeling great? Are you having life? Are you feeling pleasure? And then I just didn't quite realize, and that was the way in which the fall of good broke down into a way in which it could just be wiped out. Like I never quite saw that process until now, and as you say, then it became a question of the individual. Individual, is it good? Do I feel good? And then I loved how you sort of brought back up is that, like, the community was one step back into seeing the great, the good, in which the phenomena, the good as in the form. I'm just saying, yeah, like, I never loved the journey. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm glad that resonated with you. Yeah, I was just trying to trace out the logic of our current way of thinking about the good, and it seemed like those are the steps that it goes through. So that was just my trying to connect it back to what Plato might have been experiencing and what the difference might have been in our time, and what the steps are to get to it.
Okay. So yeah, go on.
Saying you just concurring, it's like you can definitely understand why it fell. Like, so once it became a part of the subjective, then once it became about feelings, you can just see why. Like, I remember, it didn't matter how, hearing someone make a similar argument about, like, the idea of when God became a deist, and rather than integrating into the world, then, or when nominalism happened, things could just be wiped out from the sky, and it no longer needed. Once you created two worlds, once you created a dissonance, then it could just be cut off. I guess that's one part, like what nihilism is, just kind of, once things became abstract or subjective, it's just easier just to then say, or supernatural, where the super, it can be disposed above from can just be cut off, and then that's where we're left.
Yeah. with the split of subjective and objective, it's never possible to like fully make that split. There's always the possibility that the meaninglessness of the objective bleeds back into the meaninglessness of the subjective. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any? So one final statement. Anyone wants to say anything?
I'd like to say that the confrontation with the meaninglessness of existence, if one finds themselves at that impasse, what is called nihilism, is essential. And it can be trivialized. Unfortunately, someone says, "I'm feeling this lack of meaninglessness. Here, have some Prozac. Here, have some subscription." No, not to fill the void, but to confront it. And so that's what Nishitani has read into Nietzsche, and that's what Nietzsche was saying. And aesthetics is one answer, and it's not a remedy. It's a way of experiencing the vitality of life again. Music and poetry, and create. Do not critique.
Exactly. Ravi, any final statement?
No, I think that's all I had. Thanks, Dawson, for your comment. Yeah.
We were lucky that your power went out because that Tonatio had to leave early. Not that it's good that he's gone, but it made it so by pure contingency that you presented last, and I think this was excellent that it happened so, because you brought it all back to the central theme, the idea of the good, and also in a contemporary reading of it with a phenomenological, experiential. So it's quite an interesting approach, I think. One that Heidegger could have gone down, but didn't. So I think you should pursue this further. By the way, to all the Jungians and crypto-Jungians here, of which I suspect there are many. Yes, looking at all of you now. Sean McFadden is an explicit Jungian, and he's going to teach a course on power. So if you want to delve deep into the Jungian psyche, then Sean's course is probably, if you want to take another one, of course, then. But Sean is deeply steeped in Jung. I don't know anything about Jung, so I can't comment on any of this. And I will have a look at the Philemon Foundation and Faust. I don't know if you're aware of this, Harris, but Faust has them both killed at the end of Faust 2, Philemon and Baucis, and this seals his fate as the great destroyer of any connection to the antiquity.
Yeah. Actually, Jung tried to, let's say, right that wrong. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Faustian age isn't over yet, and it has a lot more in store for us. As Nietzsche says, what's inevitably in store for us today is the total economic management of the earth. And we're only about to enter that fully, I think. But yeah, here we are. back in our time. So, thank you all very much. If we are haunted, then let's be haunted by the idea of the good, not by anything that's just made up for the sake of being performatively avant-garde. Sorry, Lizelle?
I just said amen to that.
Amen.